in the opulent ballroom of a luxury Dubai hotel, where guilt coats every surface and a single meal costs more than most people earn in a month. A wedding was taking place that would later be described by law enforcement as the most significant gathering of cocaine traffickers in modern history. The date was May 2017. Outside, the Persian Gulf shimmered under an unforgiving sun. Inside, beneath a chandelier the size of a car, Daniel Kinahan sat on a golden throne beside his bride, surrounded by men whose collective criminal empires control a third of Europe's cocaine trade worth $20 billion a year. Among the guests, a Moroccan-Dutch killer responsible for multiple execution-style murders, a Bosnian cartel leader whose organization moved tons of cocaine monthly, a Chilean drug lord who facilitated shipments from South America, an Italian mobster linked to stolen Van Gogh paintings found at his parents' home, and sitting among them, completely unknown to most of the revelers, was a confidential informant for the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, quietly filming everything, mapping the constellation of evil that filled that room. What the wedding guests didn't know, what Daniel Kinahan himself couldn't have imagined, was that this single day of celebration would become the beginning of the end. The intelligence gathered that afternoon would help law enforcement identify what they would call the super cartel. Within 5 years, nearly every major figure at that wedding would be dead or imprisoned. Every single one except Daniel Kinahan himself, who remains free in Dubai to this day, despite a $5 million reward for his capture. This is not a story about one man's rise to power in the drug trade. This is a story about how an entire system spanning Ireland, Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, the United Arab Emirates, and beyond allowed a former street-level drug dealer from Dublin's housing projects to become one of the world's most powerful cocaine traffickers. This is a story about how boxing's biggest names, from Tyson Fury to Conor McGregor, became entangled with a criminal organization responsible for at least 19 murders. This is a story about encrypted phones that criminals thought were secure, until police secretly copied every message. This is a story about a feud that turned Dublin streets into a war zone, where assassins dressed as police opened fire with AK-47s in broad daylight. This is a tale of greed, violence, betrayal, and a criminal empire so sophisticated that it rivaled nation-states in its reach, and a family so ruthless that even their allies learned to fear them. This is not a story about just another drug cartel. This is a story about how a middle-class boy from Dublin, raised by hard-working parents, transformed himself into Ireland's most wanted criminal, a man nicknamed the Dapper Don, who taught himself multiple languages in prison and ran his empire with the cold precision of a corporate executive. This is not a story about random street violence. This is a story about calculated brutality, about how a wedding weigh-in for a boxing match became the scene of a military-style assault, about how innocent men were murdered in cases of mistaken identity, about how families were shattered not because of what they did, but because of who they knew. This is not a story about criminals who got caught through traditional police work. This is a story about how the largest intelligence breach in European history, the hacking of encrypted phone networks, used by tens of thousands of criminals, finally gave law enforcement the evidence they needed. And yet, despite billions of intercepted messages, despite dozens of arrests across multiple continents, despite the combined efforts of Irish, Spanish, British, Dutch, and American agencies, the man at the center of it all walks free. This is a story about institutional failure, about how Spanish police ignored the Kinahans for years because the Irish guys keep their head down, about how boxing's governing bodies allowed a known cartel boss to become one of the sport's most powerful figures. about how Dubai became a safe haven for some of the world's most dangerous criminals. This is a tale of corruption, complicity, and the terrifying reality that in our globalized world, borders protect criminals far better than they protect the innocent, and that justice, when it finally comes, arrives too late for far too many. Before we begin this dark journey through one of the most powerful criminal organizations in European history, I want to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Are you settling in for the night in Dublin, London, or New York, looking for a deep dive into a story that goes beyond headlines and news clips? Or maybe you're working a night shift somewhere, needing something substantial to keep you company through the quiet hours. Perhaps you're in Australia or across the Pacific, starting your day with a story that will make you question how the international criminal justice system really works. Drop a comment below and let me know if you love true crime content like this. The kind that doesn't just recite facts from Wikipedia, but really digs into the psychology, the systemic failures, the human cost of organized crime. Tell me what you already know about the Kinahans. Or if this is your first time hearing about Ireland's most notorious criminal family, then hit that subscribe button right now. We're building a community of people who appreciate thorough, well-researched investigations into the world's most fascinating criminal cases. People who want to understand not just what happened, but why it happened, and what it tells us about the world we live in. Give us a like if you're ready for a story that spans 5 continents and nearly 4 decades, because I promise you, what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about how international drug cartels operate in the modern age. And if you know someone who loves true crime, organized crime history, or just incredibly well-told stories about real events, share this video with them. This is the kind of content that deserves to be seen. Now, let's begin at the beginning. In a city where rain falls more often than sunshine, where poverty and opportunity exist side by side, and where a boy named Christopher Kinahan was born into a world that would never be enough for him. Christopher Vincent Kinahan Sr. was born on March 23, 1957, in Perivale, near Ealing in West London. It was a time when waves of Irish couples traveled to Britain for work, seeking opportunities that their homeland couldn't provide. The Ireland of the 1950s was a country still recovering from decades of economic stagnation, a place where emigration was as much a rite of passage as graduation or marriage. Christy's parents, Daniel and Jean Kinahan, were part of that exodus hard-working Irish immigrants trying to build a better life in the bustling suburbs of London. But London was never meant to be permanent. When young Christy was still a child, the family returned to Ireland, settling in Dublin. The city they came back to was changing, though not always for the better. Dublin in the 1960s was a city of stark contrasts. Georgian architecture crumbling alongside new developments, traditional pubs next to modern shops, and beneath it all, the seeds of organized crime beginning to take root. The Kinahan family settled in the north inner city of Dublin, a landscape of red brick buildings, narrow streets, and tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. They were, by all accounts, a respectable family. Christy's mother worked as a cleaner. His father held down steady work. They were lower middle class. Not wealthy, but not desperate either. Christy was raised as the only son among sisters Denise, Maria, and Sally, who doted on their brother. He was given opportunities for education, for a normal life. This was not a story of a child born into criminality, forced by poverty into a life of crime. This was something different, something more complex. Christy Kinahan chose his path. To understand the Kinahan Cartel, you must first understand Dublin in the late 1960s and 1970s. The city was transforming, and not all of the changes were positive. Ireland had joined the European Economic Community in 1973, and while this brought economic benefits to some, it also created new disparities. Young people in the inner-city housing projects watched as prosperity seemed to flow everywhere except to them. The streets of Christy Kinahan's youth were places where children played football until darkness fell, where neighbors left doors unlocked, where community was everything. But they were also streets where unemployment was chronic, where opportunities were scarce, where young men often found themselves with nothing to do and nowhere to go. The pubs, always the pubs, became centers of social life, places where deals were made, where reputations were built or destroyed over a pint of Guinness. Cabra, where the Kinahan family lived for a time, was a working-class neighborhood of corporation housing, local shops, and churches that still held considerable sway over community life. The area had a particular code. You didn't inform to the authorities. You took care of your own problems, and you looked after your neighbors. This wasn't a code born of criminality. It was the survival mechanism of communities that had learned, through generations of British rule and poverty, not to trust external authority. In the late 1970s, something new arrived in Dublin that would change everything. Heroin? The drug had been largely unknown in Ireland before then, but suddenly it was everywhere, flooding into the inner-city projects with devastating effect. Families were torn apart. Young people became addicts. The traditional fabric of community life began to fray. And where there was demand, there were suppliers. Ireland's first godfathers emerged, men who saw in heroin an opportunity for wealth beyond imagination. Christy Kinahan's parents wanted better for their son. His mother, Jean, worked as a cleaner at the local Garda station, an irony that would become more pronounced as her son's criminal career developed. The Gardaí who worked there would later recall her as a pleasant woman, hardworking and friendly, universally liked despite everyone knowing who her son was and what he was becoming. Young Christy was intelligent. This was clear early on. He had a sharp mind, a capacity for languages, and a demeanor that was unusual for a boy from his background. He could affect an Anglo-Irish accent when it suited him, could dress well, could present himself as something other than what he was. This chameleon-like quality would serve him throughout his criminal career. But there was also something missing in Christy Kinahan. Prison guards who would later supervise him, detectives who would later arrest him, all noticed the same thing: an absence of warmth, a coldness, a calculating quality that separated him from other criminals. Most criminals, even hardened ones, retain some element of humanity. They laugh, they get angry, they show emotion. Christy Kinahan was different. He was controlled, always controlled. As a young man, Christy initially focused on fraud, check fraud, specifically a crime that required intelligence and nerve rather than violence. He was good at it, well-dressed, articulate. He could walk into banks and businesses and pass fraudulent checks with the confidence of a legitimate businessman. It was a relatively sophisticated crime for Dublin in the 1970s, requiring planning and a certain amount of acting ability. But fraud, while profitable, had limitations. The real money was in drugs. The Dublin of Christy Kinahan's formative years operated on unwritten rules that would shape his criminal career. The concept of being a rat, an informant, wasn't just frowned upon. It was considered the worst possible betrayal. This code would later play a central role in the bloodiest chapter of the Kinahan story, when mere suspicion of informing would lead to murders and a feud that claimed 19 lives. In the inner-city communities, There was also a strange sort of tolerance for certain types of crime. Robbing banks or defrauding corporations was one thing; those were crimes against institutions, against the system. But drug dealing, especially heroin, was different. When heroin began destroying families in the late 1970s, there was community outrage. Some dealers were targeted by vigilante groups. The Concerned Parents Against Drugs movement emerged. Ordinary mothers and fathers who staged protests outside dealers' homes, demanding they leave the neighborhood. Yet the money in heroin was irresistible. A dealer could make more in a week than a factory worker made in a year. And so some young men, including Christy Kinahan, made a calculation. The community's disapproval was a price worth paying for the wealth that drugs could bring. There was also a peculiar kind of glamour attached to successful criminals in Dublin. The Godfathers drove nice cars, wore expensive clothes, and commanded respect through fear and money. For young men with limited legitimate opportunities, this was seductive. Why work a dead-end job for minimum wage when you could make thousands, tens of thousands, dealing drugs? In 1986, 29-year-old Christy Kinahan made a mistake. Detective Michael O'Sullivan, a sharp young officer with Garda Síochána, had noticed something unusual. A new player in Dublin's heroin trade who didn't fit the typical profile. Most heroin dealers were addicts themselves. Messy and unpredictable, but Kinahan was different, organized. Efficient, clearly not a user. O'Sullivan disguised himself as an electrician one day and followed Kinahan to an apartment in Clontarf, a north side Dublin neighborhood. There, he caught Kinahan with a large quantity of heroin, 117,000 pounds worth. An enormous amount at the time. When police searched the apartment, they found not just drugs, but something that told O'Sullivan this was no ordinary criminal. Language learning cassettes? Kinahan had been teaching himself French and Arabic. Think about that for a moment. Here was a heroin dealer who, in his spare time, was studying foreign languages. This was a man with a plan. A man preparing for something bigger than just dealing drugs on Dublin streets. Kinahan was convicted and sentenced to 6 years in Portlaoise prison, one of Ireland's toughest facilities. For most criminals, prison is a punishment to be endured. For Christy Kinahan, it became a university. Portlaoise prison in the late 1980s was a grim place. The E-wing, where Kinahan was housed, was rodent-infested. Inmates slept one to a cell and urinated in buckets. Riots were common. Violence was a daily reality. Most prisoners counted the days until release. Trying to survive until freedom came, Christy Kinahan had a different approach. David MacDonald, a prison guard who supervised Kinahan, would later describe an inmate unlike any other he encountered in decades of service. Kinahan dressed smartly, slacks and a pressed shirt. Never the typical prison casual wear. He rarely socialized with other inmates. When riots broke out, he stayed in his cell. He was never caught with alcohol or drugs, contraband that virtually every other prisoner possessed at some point. Instead, Kinahan studied. He enrolled in open university courses: Spanish, Russian, Dutch. He read voraciously. He exercised his mind. When other prisoners came to him with questions about their legal cases, he advised them, despite having no formal legal training. He turned himself into a consultant, a problem solver, a brain. The only contraband ever found in Kinahan's possession was a cell phone, the first one MacDonald could recall being smuggled into Portlaoise. This wasn't for calling family or friends. This was for business. Even in prison, Kinahan was building his network, maintaining contact with associates, planning for the future. In 2001, Kinahan was offered early release for good behavior. He refused it. He had 2 months left on an open university course and wanted to finish it. He felt he could concentrate better on his studies if he remained inside. Let that sink in. A prisoner refusing early release to finish a correspondence course. MacDonald, who had seen thousands of inmates come and go, had never heard of such a thing. "I'd never, ever heard of any prisoner refusing early release," he recalled years later, still amazed by the memory, when Kinahan finally left Port Louis after serving his full sentence. He was not the same man who had entered. He was educated, disciplined, and ready to build an empire. But before Christy Kinahan would become one of the world's most wanted drug traffickers, before his name would be known to law enforcement agencies across 5 continents, before the United States government would offer $5 million for information leading to his arrest, there would be another arrest, another disappearance, and a strategic retreat to a place where the sun always shone and law enforcement rarely asked difficult questions. The stage was set for something unprecedented in Irish criminal history, a drug cartel that would eventually control a third of Europe's cocaine trade, launder billions of dollars, infiltrate the highest levels of international boxing, and turn the streets of Dublin into a war zone. But the Christy Kinahan who left Port Louis prison in 2001 was not yet that man. He was still becoming, and in Spain, far from the watchful eyes of Irish police who knew his face too well, he would find the freedom to transform from a street-level heroin dealer into something far more dangerous. A sophisticated international trafficker with the discipline of a military commander and the cold calculation of a corporate CEO. The Dublin of his youth had shaped him. Prison had educated him. But Spain would be where Christopher Kinahan truly came into his own. In 1993, a few years after his release from prison, Christy Kinahan was charged with possession of stolen checks. He was granted bail, and then, like smoke dissipating into air, he vanished. Kinahan fled to the United Kingdom, beginning what would become decades of life as an international fugitive. But this was no desperate flight. This was a calculated move. The first step in a transformation from local criminal to international operator. In the UK, specifically in Amsterdam, Kinahan found something that Dublin could never offer: opportunity. By the mid-1990s, Amsterdam had become what one investigator would later describe as the cantina from Star Wars, a place where major criminals from across Europe could freely meet, exchange contacts, and collaborate without fear of immediate arrest. British criminals, Dutch gangsters, Irish fugitives, they all gathered in the coffee shops and restaurants of Amsterdam, forming partnerships that would reshape European organized crime. It was there, in Amsterdam, that Christy Kinahan discovered his true talent, not dealing drugs on street corners, but organizing their importation on a massive scale. He met John Cunningham, another Irish fugitive who had escaped from an Irish prison in 1996 after serving time for kidnapping. Together, they began importing heroin, cannabis, cocaine, ecstasy, and weapons to Ireland. The quantities were no longer kilograms, but tons. The profits were no longer thousands, but millions. But Kinahan was learning something else. 2. The importance of staying invisible. In the Netherlands, Kinahan studied how the big players operated. He watched as Dutch criminals moved massive quantities of drugs through Rotterdam's port, one of the world's largest. He learned about the cocaine trade, which was beginning to explode across Europe as Colombian cartels, squeezed out of North America by Mexican organizations, turned their attention to European markets. Kinahan also learned about money laundering. Moving drugs was one thing. Hiding the enormous profits was another challenge entirely. He began setting up legitimate businesses, property companies, car dealerships, food import-export operations. These weren't just fronts. They were functional businesses that could absorb the rivers of cash his drug operations generated. The Dutch police eventually caught him with drugs and weapons and imprisoned him for a year. But for Kinahan, even this setback was educational. He learned what mistakes to avoid, what techniques police used, how to better insulate himself from direct evidence. When his Dutch sentence was complete, he went back to work. By now, the mid-1990s, he wasn't just a criminal, he was becoming a criminal entrepreneur. Someone who understood that the drug trade, at the highest levels, was a business requiring the same skills as any legitimate enterprise. Supply chain management, logistics, human resources, financial planning, risk assessment. In 1997, Christy Kinahan made a decision that showed both his arrogance and his sentimentality. He returned to Ireland for his father's funeral. It was a mistake. Police were waiting. He was arrested on the outstanding check fraud charges from 1993. This time there would be no bail. Kinahan was sent back to Port Louis prison, where he would serve 4 years. He was back in the E-wing, back to the rodent-infested cells and the buckets for toilets. But if the police thought this would be the end of Christopher Kinahan's criminal career, they were profoundly wrong. David MacDonald, supervising him for a second time, saw the same eerily controlled inmate. No emotion, no outbursts, no visible distress. Kinahan took more courses, read more books, and MacDonald suspected, continued running his operations from inside. The cell phone they'd found the first time was just what they'd caught him with. Who knew what other methods of communication he had? The arresting officer from 1997 would later describe Kinahan as an impressive, kind of intelligent guy, no aggression. This lack of aggression was noteworthy. Most criminals, when arrested, show anger or fear or frustration. Kinahan showed nothing. It was as if being arrested was merely an inconvenience, a temporary setback in a much longer game. Somewhere during these years, the first imprisonment, the exile to Amsterdam. The second imprisonment, Christy Kinahan completed a psychological transformation that separated him from ordinary criminals. He developed what one detective would later call an almost psychopathic level of control over his emotions. Prison guards noticed it. You wouldn't crack a smile out of him, MacDonald recalled. He's not what you'd call a nice guy. Most prisoners, if you get to know them somewhat, you can have a bit of a laugh with them about something man-united, whatever it might be, but not him. Detective O'Sullivan, who had first arrested Kinahan in 1986, observed the same quality. He's a very strategic mercenary who learns from his mistakes. He's cold and calculating. This wasn't admiration. It was the assessment of a cop who had seen hundreds of criminals and recognized that Christy Kinahan was fundamentally different. Many people who become involved in crime do so out of financial desperation, or because they grow up in criminal families, or because addiction drives them to it. Kinahan was different. He came from a middle-class family. He wasn't desperate. He wasn't driven by addiction or passion. He chose crime because he was good at it, and because legitimate life didn't offer him the power and wealth he wanted. This made him dangerous in a way that emotional criminals never are. An angry criminal makes mistakes. A desperate criminal can be predicted, but a cold, calculating criminal who plans years ahead, who refuses early release from prison to finish an educational course, who teaches himself languages because he knows he'll need them for international operations. That kind of criminal is almost unstoppable. When Christy Kinahan was released from his second stint in Port Louis prison in 2001, He made another strategic decision. He would never live in Ireland again. The Irish police knew him too well. They'd arrested him twice. They were watching him. So Kinahan moved to the Costa del Sol in southern Spain, joining other Irish criminals who had established themselves there. The Costa del Sol had everything a criminal entrepreneur could want: sunshine, luxury, proximity to Morocco for Canada's smuggling, good ports for cocaine importation from South America, and most importantly, Spanish police who had little interest in pursuing foreign criminals as long as they kept violence to a minimum. Nicola Tallant, an Irish journalist who has covered the Kinahans for decades, explained the appeal. You absolutely had to have a footprint on the Costa if you wanted to be considered a serious organized crime group in Europe. It was business and pleasure combined, a melting pot of mafias from all over Europe. Both Mexicans and Colombians also have their representatives there, vying for business partners. In Spain, Kinahan bought properties, established legitimate businesses, and began building what would become one of Europe's most powerful drug cartels. And crucially, he brought his two sons into the business. Christopher Kinahan had two sons with Jean Boylan, a woman who had never been involved in crime and who worked as a cleaner in South inner-city Dublin, ironically. At the same Garda station where his mother had once worked, Jean lived in the Oliver Bond Flats, a grim housing project near the Guinness factory, and she did not want her boys following their father into the criminal life. But the pull was too strong. Daniel, the older son, was in his late teens when his father was establishing himself in Amsterdam and Spain. He began running drugs in Dublin for his father's organization. Learning the trade from the ground up, Daniel was different from his father in temperament. Where Christy Sr. was cold and controlled, Daniel was aggressive and had what one investigator called a superiority complex. He wanted respect, wanted to be feared, wanted to prove he hadn't just inherited his position, but had earned it. His associates would say, "Yeah, he's an arrogant fuck," Noel Brown, a detective inspector within Garda Síochána, recalled. He had a whole bunch of hoodlums around him. He would always have the best clobber, the best clothes. On one level, he had a superiority complex. But he also felt that his peers in the criminal networks would see him as somebody that got it easy, that didn't have to come up the hard way. Every so often, Daniel would get paranoid and try to establish his authority. Christy Jr., 3 years younger than Daniel, was quieter, more like his father. He was being groomed for a different role, money laundering, while Daniel would handle enforcement and drug operations. Christy Jr. would handle the financial side, learning how to move money through international banks, how to set up shell companies, how to hide millions in assets. The division of labor was clear and effective. And when both brothers moved to Spain to join their father, the Kinahan organized crime group truly began by the mid-2000s. Christy Kinahan had completed his transformation. He was no longer the check fraudster from Dublin or the heroin dealer caught in Clontarf. He was the head of an international criminal organization that moved tons of drugs annually and generated hundreds of millions of euros in profits. He had learned patience from his prison sentences. He had learned organization from his language studies and business courses. He had learned international operations from his time in Amsterdam. And he had learned to insulate himself from direct evidence, to operate through lieutenants, to stay several steps removed from the actual drugs. The skills he had developed, the ability to speak multiple languages, to present himself as a legitimate businessman, to plan years ahead, to control his emotions even under interrogation. All of these would be put to use building something unprecedented in Irish criminal history. But the Kinahan Cartel's rise would not be peaceful. There would be violence, betrayals, and eventually a war that would shock even the hardened criminals of Dublin's underworld. The Dapper Don had created a machine, and like all machines, it required fuel. In this case, the fuel was blood. By 2002, the Kinahan family had relocated their center of operations from Ireland and Amsterdam to the Costa del Sol. This wasn't just a change of location, it was a strategic repositioning that would allow them to scale their operations beyond anything possible in Ireland. Spain offered unique advantages. The country's southern coast was less than 10 miles from Morocco, the world's largest producer of cannabis resin. The ports of Valencia, Barcelona, and Algeciras provided entry points for cocaine shipments from South America. The Spanish economy was booming, with construction and real estate offering perfect vehicles for money laundering. And crucially, Spanish law enforcement in the early 2000s had limited interest in foreign criminals who kept their violence elsewhere. Christy Kinahan established himself in Marbella, the jewel of the Costa del Sol, where wealthy criminals from across Europe had built mansions and lived lives of ostentatious luxury. He bought property, registered businesses, and began presenting himself as a legitimate British businessman. He used his own UK birth and his adopted Anglo-Irish accent to smooth interactions with Spanish authorities. Daniel and Christy Jr. soon joined their father, Daniel, now in his mid-20s, was eager to prove himself. He began forging relationships with other criminal organizations, operating in Spain-British gangs from Liverpool and Manchester, Dutch criminals running massive cocaine operations, and crucially, Colombian suppliers who controlled the source of what was becoming Europe's most profitable drug, cocaine. The timing was perfect. In the early 2000s, cocaine use in Europe was exploding. What had once been a drug for the wealthy was becoming mainstream, used in nightclubs from London to Berlin, from Dublin to Barcelona. The profit margins were extraordinary. A kilogram of cocaine might cost $2,000 in Colombia, $5,000 at the port in Spain, and $50,000 on the streets of Dublin or London. The Kinahans weren't just selling drugs, they were printing money. But the operation required sophistication. They needed supply chains from South America, methods of smuggling through Spanish ports, distribution networks across multiple countries, and ways to launder the enormous proceeds. This was where Christy Kinahan's years of preparation paid off. His language skills allowed him to negotiate directly with Colombian and Dutch contacts. His business acumen helped him structure the financial side, and his cold, calculating temperament meant he could make decisions, including violent ones, without emotional interference. By 2005, Irish police estimated the Kinahan organization was bringing in tens of millions of euros annually. They were no longer just an Irish gang operating internationally. They were becoming a European cartel with Irish origins. The operation worked like this. Colombian suppliers would load cocaine into shipping containers, alongside legitimate goods like coffee, machinery, or fruit. These containers would arrive at Spanish ports, where corrupt dock workers or prearranged blind spots in security would allow the drugs to be offloaded. From Spain, the cocaine would be transported by truck to the Netherlands, where Dutch partners in the organization would handle further European distribution. Some shipments went directly to Ireland and the UK, where the Kinahans had established distribution networks in Dublin, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow. The quantities were staggering. In one later seizure, police found 14 tons of cannabis resin. In another, they intercepted a container with 300 kilograms of cocaine. These weren't one-time shipments, they were regular operations, happening monthly, sometimes weekly. The Kinahans were operating at industrial scale, and with the money flooding in, they needed to clean it. This is where Christy Jr. came in. The younger Kinahan brother was establishing a network of shell companies across Europe and Ireland. The UK, Cyprus, Belgium, Panama, money from drug sales would be moved through these companies, emerging as apparently legitimate income from property deals, car sales, or food exports. Some of the Kinahan businesses were actually functional, generating real revenue that could mix with drug money, making detection nearly impossible. Belgian authorities estimated that Kinahan had laundered tens of millions through businesses in Antwerp alone. In Cyprus, during the 2013 banking crisis, investigators believed Kinahan stood to lose millions he had hidden in Cypriot bank accounts, evidence of just how much money was flowing through his operations. But with growth came attention. The Irish police, particularly the Drugs and Organized Crime Bureau, were watching. British authorities were taking interest as they noticed Irish gangs flooding UK cities with drugs. And Spanish police, despite their general hands-off approach, couldn't completely ignore the Irish criminals in their midst. The Kinahans' response was to professionalize even further. They paid for anti-surveillance training for their members. They ran exercises on hostage situations, target shooting, and martial arts. Spanish police files indicate they were creating not just a drug operation, but a paramilitary organization. In transcripts of intercepted conversations, Spanish police struggled to understand the thick Dublin accents, at one point transcribing first aid as forced aid. The organization was also branching out beyond drugs. They trafficked weapons, mostly firearms moving from Eastern Europe to Ireland. They offered money laundering services to other criminals, taking a percentage to clean their money. They ran protection rackets in Dublin, and they began investing in legitimate businesses, not just as fronts, but as genuine profit centers. Kinahan bought a casino in Belgium. He invested in Spanish real estate. He established food import-export companies that actually traded goods. By 2008, when Spanish police finally began Operation Shovel a Major investigation into the Kinahans, they estimated the organization was worth hundreds of millions of euros and was operating in at least 10 countries. But there was a problem brewing, one that would eventually lead to the bloodiest chapter in Irish criminal history. The Kinahans' success had made them arrogant. They believed they were untouchable, and that arrogance was about to lead to a murder that would change everything. To understand the Kinahan Cartel's rise, you must understand their relationship with the Hutch family, particularly Gary Hutch and his uncle Gary, the monk Hutch. Gary Hutch was a legend in Dublin's criminal underworld. Born in 1963, he grew up in the North Inner City projects, and by his 20s had become one of Ireland's most successful armed robbers. He earned his nickname, the Monk, because, unlike most criminals, he didn't drink, didn't use drugs, and lived modestly despite having stolen millions. He was disciplined, careful, and commanded enormous respect in Dublin's criminal community. The Hutches and the Kinahans came from different parts of Dublin, the Hutches from the North Inner City, the Kinahans from the south. But in Spain, geography didn't matter. Both families had relocated to the Costa del Sol by the mid-2000s, and they formed an alliance. The partnership made sense. The Hutches had connections and muscle, while the Kinahans had the international drug trafficking infrastructure. Gary Hutch, Jerry's nephew, was younger and less careful than his legendary uncle. Born in 1981, Gary was ambitious and eager to prove himself. He moved to Spain in his late 20s and became closely involved with Daniel Kinahan's operations. They were around the same age, both from Dublin. both trying to establish themselves in the international criminal world. For several years, the partnership worked well. Gary Hutch helped with enforcement, collections, and moving drugs. He was trusted enough to be present at high-level meetings. He made good money, probably hundreds of thousands of euros annually, and he was under the protection of one of Europe's most powerful criminal organizations. But Gary Hutch had a problem. He liked to take risks. In 2014, something happened that began to fracture the relationship. Though exactly what remains disputed, according to some sources, Gary attempted to rob or cheat the Kinahan organization. According to others, he was suspected of being an informant for Spanish police. What is clear is that by mid-2014, Daniel Kinahan wanted Gary Hutch dead. The first warning came in August 2014 when Jamie Moore, a British boxer training at a gym in Marbella that Daniel Kinahan had invested in, was shot twice in the leg. This was a case of mistaken identity. The gunman thought Moore was either Gary Hutch or Daniel Kinahan himself. The shooting was a message. Someone was hunting. Gary Hutch realized he was in danger. He reached out to his uncle Gary, who arranged a peace meeting with Daniel Kinahan. The terms were harsh. Gary would pay 200,000 euros to the Kinahans to atone for whatever he'd done. Additionally, Gary's brother Patrick agreed to submit to a punishment shooting. He would be shot in the leg as physical payment for Gary's transgressions. Think about that. A grown man agreeing to be shot, to have a bullet fired into his leg, to save his brother's life. Patrick Hutch went through with it. Gary paid the 200,000 euros. And for a few months, there was peace. But Daniel Kinahan had no intention of honoring the agreement, whether because he believed Gary was truly an informant, which later proved false, or because he felt disrespected and wanted to make an example, or simply because he was paranoid and ruthless. Daniel decided Gary Hutch had to die, and in the world of organized crime, such decisions, once made, are irreversible. The relationship between the Kinahans and Hutches during these years illustrated something crucial about Daniel Kinahan's character. His father, Christy Kinahan Sr., was cold but strategic. He understood that in business, even criminal business, sometimes you negotiate. Sometimes you make deals. Sometimes you let things go for the greater good of the organization. Daniel was different. He took things personally. He held grudges. He wanted not just obedience, but submission. One source close to the organization remembered Daniel's leadership style. If you didn't call him back quickly enough, he'd take it as a personal attack. He'd become paranoid, angry, like you were showing disrespect. This wasn't strategic thinking, it was emotional. Petty, dangerous. Another key partnership during this period was with John Cunningham, the Irish criminal who had escaped from prison and whom Christy Kinahan had worked with in Amsterdam. Cunningham was older, more experienced in large-scale trafficking, and he helped professionalize the Kinahan operation. He introduced them to contacts in the Netherlands and Colombia, taught them about using encrypted communications, and helped establish the routes they would use for cocaine importation. Cunningham brought something else too: connections to paramilitary groups in Ireland. The lines between political paramilitaries and organized crime had always been blurry. Groups like the Real IRA or INLA, Irish National Liberation Army, had members who were involved in drug dealing, gun running, and other criminal enterprises. These connections would later prove crucial when the Kinahans needed access to weapons for the gang war that was brewing. The Kinahans also formed partnerships with Dutch criminals who controlled access to the port of Rotterdam, one of Europe's largest and busiest ports. The Dutch provided logistical expertise, how to hide drugs in legitimate shipments, which shipping companies to use, how to corrupt or avoid port security. In exchange, they got a share of the profits and access to the Kinahan's Colombian supply lines. By 2010, the network was extensive. The Kinahans had partners in Colombia supplying cocaine, partners in Morocco supplying cannabis, partners in the Netherlands providing logistics and European distribution, partners in Liverpool and Manchester providing UK distribution, partners in Dublin and Belfast providing Irish distribution, and paramilitary connections providing weapons and muscle when needed. But partnerships in the criminal world are fragile. They're based on profit and fear, not trust or loyalty. And when something goes wrong, when suspicions arise, when someone feels disrespected or cheated, these partnerships can collapse into violence with stunning speed. The partnership with the Hutches, which had seemed so solid, so mutually beneficial, was about to be tested to destruction, and the result would be a bloodbath. The Kinahan Cartel's rise wasn't just about their criminal acumen. It was also about systemic failures in law enforcement that allowed them to operate with relative impunity for years. The primary failure was in Spain. Spanish police in the early 2000s were dealing with what seemed like an invasion of foreign criminal groups. Russian Mafia, Italian Camorra, and Nacionalita, British gangs, Dutch organizations, Eastern European trafficking networks. They were all there, buying properties, living openly, and running criminal operations. The Spanish attitude, as one Irish police source characterized it, was essentially, "We have every sort of mafia here, and the Irish guys keep their head down." This was true, to a point. Unlike some other criminal groups who brought their violence to Spain, creating headlines and forcing police action, the Kinahans initially kept their violence export only. They would have someone killed in Ireland or the Netherlands, but not in Spain. They lived quietly in their Marbella villas, drove nice cars, but not outrageously expensive ones, and avoided attracting attention. This unofficial arrangement, "We won't bother you if you don't cause problems here," allowed the Kinahans to operate almost openly in Spain for years. They registered businesses under their own names. They bought property with minimal scrutiny. They met with other criminals at restaurants and gyms without fear of surveillance. But this tolerance had limits. In 2008, when Paddy Doyle was assassinated in Esteponishot while riding in a car driven by Gary Hutch, Spanish police finally began paying serious attention. The murder was brazen, violent, and impossible to ignore. It marked the beginning of Operation Shovel, an international investigation that would involve Spanish, Irish, British, and eventually American law enforcement. Operation Shovel, however, revealed another systemic problem: the difficulty of international police cooperation. Each country had different laws about wiretaps, surveillance, evidence sharing, and extradition. Information that could be used as evidence in one country might be inadmissible in another. Investigators from Ireland would learn something crucial from their Dutch counterparts, only to find they couldn't use it in an Irish court. The Kinahans exploited these gaps ruthlessly. They kept their leadership in Spain or Dubai, places where extradition was difficult. They used encrypted communications that crossed multiple jurisdictions, making interception legally complex. They structured their operations so that the people actually touching the drugs, the ones most at risk of arrest, were low-level operatives who knew little about the broader organization. When Operation Shovel culminated in raids in May 2010, it seemed like a major victory. Christy Kinahan Sr., both his sons, and more than 30 associates were arrested. 180 bank accounts were frozen. Dozens of properties were seized. The head of the UK's Serious Organized Crime Agency declared They dealt the group a major blow, but the celebration was premature. After a few months, Christy Kinahan Sr., his sons, and most of their closest associates were released without charges. The Spanish police, despite 2 years of surveillance, hadn't gathered enough direct evidence of drug trafficking to proceed to trial. They had evidence of money laundering, of suspicious financial transactions, of associations with known criminals, but they couldn't prove, to the standard required by Spanish courts, that the Kinahans had personally trafficked drugs. A few minor associates were convicted of passport fraud or illegal gun possession, receiving short sentences, but the leadership walked free. The Criminal Assets Bureau in Ireland seized some properties, but the vast bulk of Kinahan wealth remained intact. Why did Operation Shovel fail? Several reasons. First, the Kinahans had learned from earlier arrests to insulate themselves from direct evidence. They didn't personally handle drugs or money. They communicated through intermediaries. They used encrypted phones and met face-to-face for sensitive discussions. Second, the sheer complexity of the investigation spanning multiple countries with different legal systems created opportunities for evidence to be deemed inadmissible or for procedural errors to invalidate cases. Third, and most troubling, there were suggestions of corruption. Some Spanish police officers and dock workers were suspected of being on the Kinahan payroll, though proving this was nearly impossible. An Irish police source described the frustration. We knew what they were doing. We could see the drugs coming in, the money going out. We had informants telling us about meetings, about shipments. But knowing something and proving it in court are different things, and the Kinahans were very good at making sure we couldn't prove it. The failure of Operation Shovel was a turning point. The Kinahans learned they could survive major police operations. This made them bolder, more confident, more willing to take risks. And it shifted power within the organization. Christy Kinahan Sr. was extradited to Belgium on the money laundering charges there, where he served 2 years. During his absence, Daniel took over day-to-day operations. Daniel had none of his father's patience or strategic thinking. He was aggressive, paranoid, and increasingly willing to use violence to solve problems. Under his leadership, the organization became more brutal and less disciplined. There was also the question of Irish law enforcement capabilities. The Garda Síochána is a relatively small force by European standards, and its resources for investigating international organized crime were limited. The Drugs and Organized Crime Bureau, DOCB, was understaffed and underfunded. Investigators would identify major shipments, but lacked the resources to conduct sustained surveillance. They would develop intelligence about Kinahan operations, but struggled to turn that intelligence into evidence admissible in court. Moreover, Irish law at the time made it difficult to use certain types of evidence. Phone intercepts had strict requirements. Testimony from criminal informants could be challenged as unreliable. Financial records from foreign banks required international legal processes that took months or years. The Kinahans, with their international structure, were exploiting every gap in the system. The British authorities faced similar challenges. The National Crime Agency, NCA, knew the Kinahans were supplying massive quantities of drugs to UK cities. But the Kinahans never set foot in Britain. They operated through lieutenants like Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, who ran UK operations from Birmingham. Arresting Kavanagh was possible. Connecting him definitively to the Kinahans in ways that would hold up in court was much harder. There was also a question of priorities for Spanish police. The Kinahans were one of dozens of foreign criminal groups operating in their territory. For Irish police, the Kinahans were a major target, but they were also dealing with other gangs, with dissident Republican terrorism, with everyday crime. For British police, the Kinahans were suppliers, but the focus was often on the street-level dealers and the violence they caused in UK cities. The Kinahans understood all of this. They knew that law enforcement was fractured, under-resourced, hampered by legal limitations and international complications. And they used that knowledge to build an empire. But they made one critical mistake. They believed the system would continue to protect them. They didn't anticipate that technology would change the game entirely. And they certainly didn't anticipate that their encrypted phones, the devices they believed were completely secure, were being read by police in real time. That revelation was still years away. For now, in the early 2010s, the Kinahans seemed untouchable. Operation Shovel had failed. Their leadership was intact. Their operations were more profitable than ever. And they were about to expand into new territory, not just moving drugs and guns, but infiltrating the highest levels of international boxing. But first, there would be blood, because in September 2015, Gary Hutch would be murdered in Marbella, and the feud that followed would claim 19 lives and turn Dublin into a war zone. By 2012, cocaine had become the Kinahan organization's primary source of revenue. Far surpassing cannabis or other drugs, the operation worked on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. We're not talking about individuals carrying kilograms in suitcases. We're talking about multi-ton shipments in cargo containers. The cocaine came primarily from Colombia, though later also from Peru and Bolivia, as the organization diversified its sources. Colombian cartels would arrange for the cocaine to be loaded into shipping containers at ports like Buenaventura or Cartagena. The containers would officially hold legitimate cargo coffee, fruit, machinery, textiles, hidden within these legal goods, sometimes in secret compartments welded into the container structure itself, would be hundreds of kilograms of cocaine compressed into bricks and wrapped in plastic. These containers would travel across the Atlantic to European ports, primarily Valencia in Spain, but also Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and occasionally Antwerp in Belgium. The journey took 2 to 3 weeks. Upon arrival, the containers would need to be offloaded and the drugs extracted without detection. This is where corruption became essential. Port security, even at major European ports, has gaps. There are tens of thousands of containers arriving daily. Customs agents can physically inspect only a small percentage. The Kinahans exploited this reality through multiple methods, bribing dock workers to ensure certain containers weren't inspected, using front companies to import the containers so they appeared legitimate, and timing arrivals during shifts when friendly workers were on duty. Once offloaded, the cocaine was transported by truck to distribution centers. The Netherlands served as the primary hub for European distribution. From there, drugs would be moved to Ireland, the UK, Scotland, and throughout continental Europe. The UK market alone was worth tens of millions annually to the Kinahans. Irish police estimated that about 75% of Kinahan drugs were destined for Britain, with only 25% staying in Ireland. The quantities are staggering when you look at specific seizures in one operation. Police intercepted 14 tons of cannabis and 300 kilograms of cocaine connected to the Kinahans. In another, they found shipments valued at over 30 million pounds. These weren't one-time events, they were monthly operations. When you miss one shipment, you send another. The profit margins were extraordinary. A kilogram of pure cocaine in Colombia cost approximately $2,000 to $3,000. Shipped to Europe, that same kilogram was worth $30,000 to $40,000 wholesale, cut and distributed on UK or Irish streets. It could generate $80,000 to $100,000 in revenue, with shipments of hundreds of kilograms monthly. The mathematics are simple. The Kinahans were generating hundreds of millions of euros annually from cocaine alone, while cocaine was more profitable per kilogram. Cannabis resin from Morocco represented high-volume, lower-risk trafficking. Morocco produces hundreds of tons of cannabis resin annually, and Spain's proximity to North Africa makes smuggling relatively straightforward. The Kinahans used fast boats go fasts to move cannabis resin from Morocco to Spain. These were high-powered speedboats that could outrun most Coast Guard vessels. They'd load up with several hundred kilograms, make the crossing at night, and offload at pre-arranged locations on the Spanish coast. The cannabis was then transported by truck throughout Europe. Because cannabis is bulkier and less valuable than cocaine, the operations had to be higher volume. A typical shipment might be 1 to 2 tons. The profit margin was lower, maybe $2,000 per kilogram versus $30,000 for cocaine, but the quantities made up for it. Irish police estimated the Kinahans were importing tons of cannabis monthly. Much of this went to the UK market, where cannabis remained the most widely used illegal drug. The Kinahans didn't retail the cannabis themselves. They were wholesalers, selling to mid-level dealers who would then distribute to street-level sellers. Moving drugs generates enormous amounts of cash, literally suitcases and garbage bags full of money. Converting this into usable assets without attracting law enforcement attention requires sophisticated money laundering. The Kinahans used multiple methods. Property investments. They bought real estate across Europe, Spain, Ireland, UK, Belgium, Cyprus. Properties would be purchased through shell companies, often using nominees whose names appeared on the deeds. The properties could then be sold, with the proceeds appearing as legitimate real estate profits. Christy Kinahan owned casinos, restaurants, car dealerships, all purchased with drug money, but generating apparently legal income. Shell companies. Christy Jr. was particularly skilled at this. He established dozens of companies registered in Ireland, UK, Cyprus, Panama, and other jurisdictions with loose financial oversight. Money from drug sales would be deposited into accounts held by these companies, moved between accounts in different countries, and eventually emerge as payments for vague services, consulting fees, management fees, licensing agreements. Trade-based laundering. Some of their food import-export companies were actually functional businesses. They would inflate the value of legitimate transactions. For example, they might import coffee from Colombia, claim it cost twice what it actually did, and use the inflated price to justify large payments to Colombian accounts payments that included drug purchase. Money hidden within the legitimate transactions. Hawala networks. For moving money to and from the Middle East and Asia. They used Hawala, an informal value transfer system based on trust rather than formal banking. A dealer in Dublin would give cash to a Kinahan associate, who would contact a counterpart in Dubai. That counterpart would then give the equivalent amount, minus fees, to the Kinahans in Dubai, all without money actually crossing borders or appearing in bank records. Cryptocurrency. In later years, the Kinahans began using Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Boxers working with Daniel Kinahan were sometimes paid in cryptocurrency. This had multiple advantages. It was difficult to trace. It could move across borders instantly, and it could be converted back to cash through various exchanges. The amounts being laundered were enormous. Belgian authorities estimated Kinahan had moved tens of millions through businesses in Antwerp alone. During the 2013 Cyprus banking crisis, investigators believed Kinahan stood to lose millions he had hidden in Cypriot accounts. just one of many places he stored wealth. Europol estimated the Kinahan organization was worth approximately 1 billion euros, about $12 billion. This wasn't pure profit. It included assets, ongoing inventory, accounts receivable from dealers who hadn't yet paid. But even allowing for overestimation, the Kinahans were likely worth hundreds of millions of euros, making them one of the wealthiest criminal organizations in Europe. Weapons trafficking, while less central to their operations than drugs, the Kinahans also trafficked weapons, primarily firearms from Eastern Europe to Ireland. The Irish market for illegal guns was relatively small, but consistent dissident Republican groups needed weapons, as did other criminal gangs. The Kinahans sourced guns primarily from Lithuania, Moldova, and other former Soviet countries where weapons were cheaply available. These would be smuggled into Western Europe, often hidden in the same truck shipments used for drugs. A pistol that cost $200 in Lithuania might sell for $2,000 to $3,000 in Ireland. The weapons trade also served a practical purpose. It ensured the Kinahans had access to firearms when they needed them for enforcement or protection. When the gang war with the Hutches began, the Kinahans were able to quickly arm their associates with military-grade weapons, including AK-47s and even rocket launchers. Extortion and protection, while not their primary business, the Kinahans also ran protection rackets in Dublin. Drug dealers operating in certain areas had to pay tribute to the Kinahans or face violence. This was less about the money extortion, probably generated only a few million annually, and more about control. It ensured that other criminals knew the Kinahans were in charge. There were also reports of the Kinahans extorting legitimate businesses, particularly in the nightclub and hospitality industries. Club owners might be approached and told they needed to pay for security or protection. The implicit threat was clear: pay or face vandalism, violence, or worse, services to other criminals. As the Kinahans' reputation grew, they began offering services to other criminal organizations. They would arrange cocaine shipments for groups who didn't have their own Colombian connections. Taking a percentage of the profit, they would launder money for other criminals, charging fees of 20 to 30%. They provided access to their UK distribution network for European gangs looking to enter the British market. This diversification made them even more central to European organized crime. They weren't just a drug cartel, they were becoming criminal infrastructure, a service provider that other organizations depended on. The scale and context. To understand the scale, Europol estimated the Kinahan organization controlled approximately 1/3 of Europe's cocaine trade at its peak. Europe consumes approximately 100 tons of cocaine annually. 1/3 of that is over 30 tons. Even if this estimate was inflated and the true figure was 15 to 20 tons, that's still an almost incomprehensible quantity. At $40,000 per kilogram wholesale, 15 tons generates $600 million in revenue. After costs paying Colombian suppliers, bribing officials, paying associates, losing shipments to seizures, the net profit was probably 30 to 40%. That's still $180 million to $240 million annually. And this was just cocaine. Add cannabis, weapons, money laundering fees, and extortion, and the total annual revenue was probably $300 million to $500 million, with net profits of $100 million to $200 million annually. The Kinahan organization wasn't just a criminal gang. It was a multinational corporation that happened to operate outside the law. The Kinahan Cartel's business model depended on violence and the threat of violence. In the drug trade, you can't sue over breach of contract or call the police when someone steals from you. You enforce compliance through fear. The Kinahans had a reputation for brutality that served them well. If someone owed them money and didn't pay, they didn't send reminders, they sent enforcers. The debtor might be beaten, shot in the leg, or, if the amount was large enough, killed. One former associate described the Kinahan approach. They'd give you one warning, maybe two if they liked you. After that, you were done. And when I say done, I mean done. They'd kill you. Kill your family if they thought it necessary. There was no negotiation, no pleading your case. You paid or you died. This reputation meant most people paid. The violence, paradoxically, made more violence unnecessary. When everyone knows you'll kill over a 10,000 euros debt, nobody lets debts reach 10,000 euros. The organization employed several full-time enforcers men whose job was intimidation and violence. These weren't sophisticated criminals. They were muscle, often former boxers or nightclub bouncers. Men who were comfortable using their fists and knew how to use a gun. But the Kinahans also hired contract killers for more serious work. These were professionals, often not Irish, who would be brought in for specific jobs. The advantage of using outsiders was deniability, if caught. The killer couldn't implicate the Kinahans because they'd never actually met them. All communication would go through intermediaries. The methods varied depending on the message being sent. A beating was for minor offenses, disrespect, late payments. A shooting in the leg was more serious, a final warning, or punishment for attempting to cheat the organization. Execution was reserved for those who informed to police, who stole large amounts, or who posed a threat to the leadership. The execution method often carried its own message. A quick shot to the head was almost merciful, a professional hit. Being shot multiple times, or killed slowly, suggested personal animosity or a desire to send a message. Bodies left in public places were warnings to others. Bodies that disappeared entirely were about eliminating evidence, but also about leaving families in agonizing uncertainty. In Spain, the Kinahans tried to keep violence to a minimum. They understood that Spanish authorities would tolerate their presence only as long as they didn't create headlines. So murders in Spain were relatively rare, and, when they occurred, were carried out professionally quick. Clean, bodies disposed of efficiently. But in Ireland, the Kinahans were less restrained. Dublin gangland had always been violent, and the Kinahans fit right in. They were responsible for numerous murders in Ireland. Though proving their involvement was difficult, the killers were often several steps removed from the leadership. Daniel Kinahan might decide someone needed to die. Tell a lieutenant, who would tell another associate, who would hire a gunman. By the time the trigger was pulled, there were 4 or 5 degrees of separation. The most public display of Kinahan violence was yet to come. The Regency Hotel attack in 2016 would shock Ireland and finally force authorities to make the Kinahans a top priority. But even before that, the organization had been responsible for beatings, shootings, and murders across Dublin. Associates who spoke to police described a climate of fear within the organization. Daniel Kinahan was paranoid. They said, always worried about informants, always suspicious of anyone who seemed too close to police. This paranoia made him dangerous even to his own people. If Daniel decided you were a risk, your years of loyal service meant nothing. One investigator observed, with Christy Sr., violence was strategic. He'd kill someone if it served a purpose, if it was necessary for the business. But Daniel took things personally. He'd kill someone because they disrespected him, because they looked at him wrong, because they didn't call him back quickly enough. He was emotional, which in that world is incredibly dangerous. This temperament would eventually lead to the downfall. Because when Daniel decided Gary Hutch had to die, not because it was good for business, but because he felt disrespected and paranoid, he triggered a war that would bring unprecedented law enforcement attention, cost the organization tens of millions in seized assets, and eventually lead to the U.S. sanctions that crippled their operations. But in the early 2010s, before the war, the violence was working. The Kinahans were feared throughout the European underworld. Other criminals knew that crossing the Kinahans meant death, and that knowledge kept most people in line. On September 24, 2015, at approximately 11:30 in the morning, Gary Hutch walked out of his apartment in the Miraflores neighborhood of Marbella, Spain. He was 34 years old, unarmed, and had been living in fear for months, knowing the Kinahans wanted him dead. Despite the 200,000 euros he paid, despite his brother taking a bullet to the leg, Gary knew the debt wasn't settled. He'd been told to leave Spain, to disappear somewhere the Kinahans couldn't find him. But he'd stayed, perhaps believing the payment had bought him safety, perhaps unable to imagine his former partners would really kill him. He was wrong. As Gary walked toward his car in the parking area of the apartment complex, a man approached. Witnesses would later say Gary recognized his killer, that he raised his hands in a pleading gesture. He begged for his life, right there in the parking lot. Under the Spanish sun, it didn't matter. The gunman fired multiple times. Gary Hutch fell. The killer stood over him and fired again, making sure. Then he fled in a waiting vehicle, disappearing into the labyrinth of marvelous streets. Spanish police arrived to find Gary Hutch dead in a pool of blood, surrounded by shell casings. Within hours, word reached Dublin. Gary's family was devastated. His uncle, Gary the Monk Hutch, was reportedly in shock. They had paid the money. Patrick had taken the punishment shooting. What more did the Kinahans want? The answer was clear. They wanted Gary dead, regardless of any agreements. In 2018, James Quinn, a Dublin criminal and former boxer, was convicted in Spain for his role in the murder. Evidence showed he'd acted as a lookout and helped the killer reach and flee the scene. But Quinn was small time. Everyone knew the order had come from higher up, from Daniel Kinahan himself, Gary Hutch, a man who'd spent decades in organized crime and prided himself on professionalism, now faced an impossible choice. His nephew had been murdered despite paying everything demanded. The disrespect was total. The Hutch's reputation in Dublin's underworld depended on how they responded. For months, Gary Hutch tried to maintain peace. He didn't want a war. He was in his 50s, semi-retired, wealthy enough to live comfortably without active crime. A war would be bad for everyone. People would die. Police attention would intensify. Business would suffer. But younger members of the Hutch gang didn't want restraint. They wanted revenge. And the Kinahans, confident in their superior numbers and firepower, weren't offering any path to peace. The first public sign of retaliation came in February 2016. But before we get to the Regency Hotel attack, the event that would define the Kinahan-Hutch feud, we need to understand who else died. Because Gary Hutch wasn't just a statistic. He was a human being with a family, with a mother who cleaned houses for a living, with siblings and children and people who loved him. His mother attended his funeral in Dublin, brought home from Spain. She wept as they lowered his coffin into Irish soil. She had warned her children against the criminal life, had tried to keep them on the straight path, but the streets had claimed Gary anyway. And now, all she had left was grief and a conviction that someone would pay for her son's death. She was right about that last part. The Hutch-Kinahan feud would eventually claim 19 lives. These weren't just numbers. weren't just names in news reports. They were human beings' fathers, sons, brothers, uncles. Some were criminals who knew the risks. Others were innocent men killed by mistake. Each death left behind shattered families, children without fathers, parents who would spend years seeking justice or revenge. Let's talk about them. Let's say their names and remember who they were. Victim 1, Gary Hutch, age 34. Died September 24, 2015. We've discussed Gary's murder, but who was he before he became a victim? Gary Hutch was born in 1981 in Dublin's North Inner City. He grew up in Champions Avenue, a street that had produced both boxers and criminals. Sometimes in the same family, his uncle, Gary, the monk Hutch, was already a legendary figure in Dublin crime by the time Gary was a teenager. Gary was athletic, good-looking, and charismatic. He could have been many things. Instead, he chose crime, following his uncle's path. By his 20s, he'd been convicted of armed robbery and served time. After release, he moved to Spain, where he became involved with the Kinahan organization. For several years, Gary lived well. He had money, drove nice cars, lived in a pleasant apartment in Marbella. He had a partner and children. On social media, he posted photos from nightclubs and restaurants, living the life that many young men from Dublin's projects could only dream of. But Gary had a reckless streak. Whether he tried to rob the Kinahans, or was suspected of informing to police, or simply ran his mouth when he should have stayed quiet, we may never know the full truth. What we know is that by 2014, he'd crossed the line he couldn't uncross. His final months were filled with fear. He knew he was marked for death. He tried to pay his way out. He tried to negotiate. He tried everything except the one thing that might have saved him, disappearing completely when he was murdered. Gary left behind his partner and children, his mother, Jean, who had tried so hard to keep her children out of the criminal life, now had to bury her nephew. The funeral in Dublin was attended by hundreds of mix of family, friends, and criminals paying their respects. Gary Hutch's death wasn't just the murder of one man. It was the beginning of a war that would consume nearly 2 years and cost 18 more lives. Victim 2, David Byrne, age 34, died February 5, 2016. If Gary Hutch's death was the spark, David Byrne's death was the explosion that turned a simmering conflict into open warfare. David Byrne was born in 1982 in Raleigh Square in Crumlin, a working-class South Side Dublin neighborhood. He was one of a new breed of criminals, younger men who'd grown up in the prosperity of the Celtic Tiger years, but who'd been drawn to crime anyway, not by poverty, but by the excitement, the money, and the respect it brought. Byrne was a senior member of the Kinahan organization. Not leadership Daniel Kinahan ran things, but important enough to be trusted with significant responsibilities. He moved between Dublin and Spain, conducting most of his criminal activities cross-border. He was part of the Kinahan Operations European network, helping coordinate drug shipments and distribution. David was muscular, well-dressed, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew he was protected by a powerful organization. He enjoyed boxing and often attended matches. He was present at the Regency Hotel on February 5, 2016, not as a fighter, but as a spectator at a boxing weigh-in organized by Daniel Kinahan. The Regency Hotel was hosting the weigh-in for a boxing match scheduled for the next day. It was meant to be a social event. Boxers, promoters, fans, media all gathered in the hotel's function room. Daniel Kinahan was there, as was his father, Christy Kinahan Jr., and several other senior Kinahan associates. At approximately 2:30 p.m., 6 men burst into the hotel. 2 were dressed as members of the Garda Emergency Response Unit Ireland's elite police tactical team, complete with uniforms and assault rifles. Others wore masks and tactical gear. They moved through the hotel with military precision. Their target was Daniel Kinahan. The plan was to execute him in front of everyone. To make a statement that the Hutches weren't afraid of the mighty Kinahans, it was a bold plan, almost insanely so. But Daniel wasn't in the function room when the shooting started. He'd stepped out, perhaps sensing something wrong, perhaps just by luck. As soon as the gunman burst in and started firing, Daniel ran. He fled out a back exit and was driven away. David Byrne wasn't so lucky. The gunman, realizing their primary target was gone, opened fire anyway. Byrne was hit multiple times with high-velocity rounds in the head. Face, chest, abdomen. The shooting was captured on security cameras. Witnesses described it as like a war zone. People diving for cover, screaming, the deafening sound of AK-47s firing in the enclosed space. David Byrne died on the floor of the Regency Hotel. Aged 34. 2 others were wounded, but survived. The attack shocked Ireland. This wasn't a shooting in a dark alley or a deserted parking lot. This was broad daylight, in a busy hotel with dozens of witnesses. The killers had disguised themselves as police, bringing a whole new level of audacity to Irish gangland crime. David Byrne's father, Jim Byrne, was devastated but also furious. In the aftermath, he reportedly refused to sanction any peace talks while the Hutches continued their attacks. "I want them all dead," he allegedly told associates. His son's murder had to be avenged. For David's family, there was the horror of his violent death, played out in public, captured on video that would be shown repeatedly in news reports. There was the knowledge that he'd been killed instead of the intended target. And there was the certainty that more violence would follow, that revenge would beget revenge in an endless cycle. David Byrne's funeral was attended by hundreds of Kinahan associates. The display of force was intentional, a message to the Hutches that the Kinahans had the numbers, the weapons, and the will to win this war. The message was received. Within days, the Kinahans would strike back. Victim 3, Eddie Hutch Sr., age 59, died February 8, 2016, 3 days after the Regency Hotel attack. At approximately 6 a.m. on Monday, February 8, 2016, armed men approached a modest house on Poplar Row in Dublin's north inner city. Inside was Eddie Hutch Sr., aged 59, a taxi driver and brother of Gary the Monk Hutch. Eddie was not a major criminal. He'd never been involved in the drug trade or armed robbery. He was, by the standards of his neighborhood, an ordinary working man who happened to be related to someone famous in the criminal world. That relationship cost him his life. The killers forced their way into Eddie's home. He was shot multiple times at close range. He had no chance to defend himself, no opportunity to plead for his life. The shooting was execution style, cold and professional. Eddie Hutch's murder was pure revenge for David Byrne's death at the Regency. The Kinahans couldn't immediately reach the people who'd actually carried out that attack. They were in hiding, so they targeted someone connected to the Hutch family. It didn't matter that Eddie wasn't involved in the feud, wasn't a criminal, posed no threat to anyone. He was a Hutch. That was enough. Eddie's wife discovered his body. The trauma of finding her husband's remains, shot to death in their own home, was devastating. Their children and grandchildren were left to grapple with the senseless killing of a man who'd done nothing to anyone. Eddie Hutch's funeral was a massive event. Hundreds attended, including his brother Gary, whose presence was noted by police. It was clear that the Hutches were rallying, that more violence was inevitable for Eddie's family. There was grief mixed with rage. He'd been an innocent, killed only because of his name. His widow would later tell reporters that he'd been a good man, a hard worker, someone who'd raised his children and paid his bills and never harmed anyone. None of that mattered to the Kinahans. In their calculation, killing Eddie Hutch sent a message. Nobody connected to the Hutch gang was safe. Not the criminals, not their families, not their relatives, no matter how distant from the actual conflict. Victim 4, Noel Duggan, age 55. Died March 23, 2016, Noel king size. Duggan got his nickname from his considerable size. He was a large, imposing man. Born in 1961, he'd grown up in Cabra in northwest Dublin and had been involved in criminal activity for decades. Duggan wasn't a drug dealer or a violent enforcer. His specialty was cigarette smuggling. Ireland has extremely high tobacco taxes, making smuggled cigarettes very profitable. Duggan ran one of the most successful cigarette smuggling operations in Ireland, bringing in containers of untaxed cigarettes from Eastern Europe and Asia and selling them at discount prices to shops and individuals. This made him wealthy. He lived in a nice house in Rathoath, County Meath, in a suburban estate far from the inner-city projects where he'd grown up. He drove expensive cars and lived well. He was also a friend of Gary Hutch, and that friendship would prove fatal. On March 23, 2016, at approximately 7:30 p.m., Duggan was sitting in his car outside his home in Rathoath. He'd just returned from somewhere and was about to go inside when a gunman approached. Multiple shots were fired through the car window. Duggan was hit several times and died at the scene. Residents of the quiet suburban estate were shocked. This was not a place where gang assassinations happened. People had moved there precisely to escape Dublin's urban problems. Now, a man had been executed right on their street. Duggan had no direct involvement in the Hutch-Kinahan feud. He wasn't involved in drugs, wasn't involved in the Regency attack, but he was close to Gary Hutch, had been photographed with him, was known to be part of his circle, to the Kinahans. That made him a legitimate target. For Noel Duggan's family, he left behind children and grandchildren. The murder was senseless. He'd been a smuggler, yes, but a non-violent one. He posed no threat to the Kinahans. His death served no strategic purpose. It was pure intimidation. A message that anyone close to the Hutches would be killed. As of 2023, no one has been convicted of Duggan's murder. His family continues to seek justice, though they likely know that in Irish gangland, justice is rare. Victim 5, Martin O'Rourke, age 24. Died April 14, 2016. Martin O'Rourke was not a criminal. He had no connection to the Hutches or the Kinahans. He was an innocent man killed by mistake. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong appearance. Martin was just 24 years old, living on Lower Sheriff Street in Dublin's north inner city. He worked in construction and lived with his partner. He had his whole life ahead of him. On April 14, 2016, at approximately 5:30 p.m., Martin was walking on Sheriff Street when a gunman approached and opened fire. Martin was shot multiple times and died at the scene. Why? Because someone in the Kinahan organization thought he was someone else. Martin's appearance was similar to a member of the Hutch gang. A killer didn't verify the target, didn't make sure he had the right person. He just shot and fled. Martin O'Rourke's family was destroyed by his death. His partner, his mother, his siblings, they couldn't understand why he'd been killed. He wasn't involved in anything. He was just a young man trying to make a living, trying to build a life. The senselessness of Martin's murder exemplifies the human cost of gang warfare. When criminal organizations go to war, innocent people die. Mistaken identity, proximity to targets. Just being in the wrong place, any of these, can be fatal when killers are operating under orders to shoot first and verify later. Martin O'Rourke's mother gave a victim impact statement at a later trial. She described the agony of losing her son, of the constant nightmares, of the questions that would never be answered. Why him? She asked, what did he ever do to anyone? The answer, heartbreaking in its simplicity, nothing. He did nothing. He was just collateral damage in someone else's war. Gardaí believe Glenn Clark, a Kinahan associate, was responsible for Martin's murder. Clark was found dead in December 2016. Shot in the head in a stolen car, likely killed by the Kinahans themselves for botching the job or for becoming a liability. Victim 6, Michael Barr, age 35. Died April 25, 2016. Michael Barr was killed on April 25, 2016, in the Sunset House pub in Summerhill, Dublin. He was 35 years old, a father, and by all accounts, trying to turn his life around. Michael had connections to dissident Republican groups specifically. He'd been associated with people in the real IRA. He also had some criminal history, including involvement in a theft at the Mansion House Hotel. But he wasn't a major player in organized crime, so why was he killed? Gardaí believe Michael Barr provided logistical support for the Regency Hotel attack, specifically that he helped source the weapons used and possibly provided a safe house. Whether he knew what the weapons would be used for, whether he willingly participated or was coerced, remains unclear. On the evening of April 25th, Michael was working behind the bar at the Sunset House. He was pulling pints, serving customers, doing his job. At approximately 9:30 p.m., a gunman entered the pub and opened fire with a semi-automatic pistol. Michael was hit multiple times. Customers dove for cover. The gunman calmly walked out and escaped. Michael Barr died behind his own bar, his blood pooling on the floor where moments earlier he'd been serving drinks. For Michael's family, the tragedy was compounded by the location. This wasn't a gangland shooting in a dark alley. It was in a pub, during business hours, in front of witnesses. The coldness of it, the calculation, was horrifying. Michael's partner spoke of him as a good father who loved his children, who'd been trying to make an honest living. Whether his involvement in the Regency attack was voluntary or forced, whether he truly understood what he was getting involved in, we'll never know. Eamon Cumberton was later convicted of Michael Barr's murder and sentenced to life in prison. But for Michael's family, no prison sentence could bring him back or answer the questions that haunted them. Victim 7, Gareth Hutch, age 36, died May 24, 2016. Gareth Hutch was Gary Hutch's cousin. He was 36 years old, a father, and a minor figure in the criminal world, some drug dealing. Some petty crime, nothing major. On May 24, 2016, Gareth was in the parking area of the Avondale House apartment complex, where he lived on North Strand in Dublin. It was approximately 8:30 a.m. Morning light, people heading to work. Two killers approached on foot. They wore disguises, but made no elaborate preparations. They simply walked up to Gareth Hutch as he stood near his van and opened fire. Gareth was hit multiple times. He tried to run but collapsed. The killers stood over him and fired more shots, ensuring he was dead. Then they fled. Residents of Avondale House, many of whom knew Gareth, were traumatized. Some had heard the shots, looked out their windows, and seen him dying in the parking area. Children saw the aftermath of blood. The forensic investigators the body being taken away for Gareth's family. His death was another devastating blow. Gary had been murdered in Spain. Now Gareth was dead too. How many Hutches would the Kinahans kill? Where would it end? Gareth left behind children who would grow up without their father. He left behind a partner who had to explain to those children why Daddy wasn't coming home. He left behind parents who had now lost a nephew and a son to the same senseless feud. In November 2018, Jonathan Kehoe, his sister Regina Kehoe, and Thomas Fox were found guilty of Gareth Hutch's murder and sentenced to life in prison. The trial revealed the cold calculation behind the killing surveillance of Gareth's movements, planning of escape routes, coordination between multiple individuals. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a business decision, an item checked off a list. Gareth Hutch was targeted, located, and executed with the efficiency of a corporate downsizing. Victim 8, David Douglas, age 55. Died July 1st, 2016. David Douglas ran a small shop on Bridgefoot Street in Dublin, ate with his wife. He was 55 years old and had some involvement in the drug trade, but at a relatively low level. Douglas had survived one murder attempt in November 2015. When he'd been shot and wounded, he recovered from those injuries. But the experience left him fearful. He knew he was a target. On July 1st, 2016, at approximately 5:30 p.m., Douglas was outside his shop when a gunman on a motorcycle pulled up. The killer fired multiple shots. Douglas tried to seek cover, but was hit several times. He died on the street outside the shop where he'd worked alongside his wife. The location of the murder, a busy street in daylight, showed the brazenness of the killers. They didn't care about witnesses, didn't care about being seen. The intimidation was part of the point. David Douglas's wife witnessed her husband's murder, the trauma of seeing him shot to death. Right outside their business was unimaginable. She'd already lived through one attack on him. Now he was gone. Douglas had been targeted because of his association with the Hutch gang and his involvement in the drug trade. But he was a minor player, not a major target. His death, like so many others, served primarily to show that the Kinahans could kill anyone they wanted. Anywhere they wanted. Lee Kinahan was later found guilty of Douglas's murder. But for David's family, the conviction brought little comfort. He was gone, killed on a summer evening outside his own shop, in front of his wife. Because of a gang war he'd had no power to stop. Victim 9, Trevor O'Neill, age 41, died August 17, 2016. Trevor O'Neill was a Dublin City Council worker. He had no involvement in crime, no connection to either the Hutches or the Kinahans. He was an ordinary working man on holiday with his family in Majorca, Spain. On August 17, 2016, Trevor was in the Costa del Sol area near Magaluf. He was with his wife and children, enjoying a family vacation. At approximately 8:30 p.m., as they walked near their accommodation, a gunman approached and opened fire. Trevor O'Neill was shot 5 times in front of his wife and children. He collapsed on the street and died. His family, traumatized beyond measure, watched him die. Why was Trevor killed? Because he looked like a member of the Hutch family. The Kinahan organization had hired a hitman to find and kill Hutch associates in Spain. That hitman, likely Glenn Clark, mistakenly identified Trevor O'Neill as a Hutch target. Trevor O'Neill had never committed a crime in his life. He worked for Dublin City Council. He was a devoted husband and father. He was on vacation, trying to give his family a nice holiday, and he was executed in front of them because he had the misfortune of looking like someone else. Trevor's widow and children were left with trauma. it would last a lifetime. The children saw their father shot to death. The widow watched her husband murdered for no reason at all. They'd gone on vacation as a happy family and came home broken, with a casket instead of souvenirs. Trevor O'Neill's murder exemplifies the utter disregard for innocent life that characterized the Kinahan organization at this point in the feud. They were so intent on killing Hutches that they didn't bother to verify targets. Anyone who looked similar was at risk, as with Martin O'Rourke. Glenn Clark is believed responsible for this murder as well. Clark was found dead in December 2016, the Kinahans cleaning up their mess by eliminating the man who'd made it. For Trevor O'Neill's family, there has been no justice. No one was convicted of his murder. He's buried in Ireland, mourned by people who loved him. A man whose only crime was being in the wrong place with the wrong appearance. Victim 10, Noel Kirwan, age 62. Died December 22, 2016. Noel Duck Egg Kirwan was 62 years old. A close associate of Gary Hutch, and by all accounts not involved in the ongoing feud. He was semi-retired from criminal activity, living quietly in Ronanstown in West Dublin. Noel's fatal mistake was being photographed talking to Gary Hutch at Eddie Hutch's funeral in February 2016. That photograph, published in newspapers, marked him for death. On December 22, 2016, just before Christmas, Noel was arriving home at approximately 5:30 p.m. His partner was with him. As they approached their house, a gunman emerged and opened fire. Noel Kirwan was shot multiple times in front of his partner. He fell in his own driveway. His partner, helpless and horrified, watched him die. The timing just days before Christmas added to the cruelty. Noel's family was preparing for the holidays. Instead, they were planning a funeral. Noel Kirwan's murder showed that the Kinahans were working from a list, systematically eliminating anyone connected to the Hutches. It didn't matter if you were actively involved in the feud. It didn't matter if you were elderly and retired. If you were photographed with a Hutch, you were marked for death. Several people were later convicted of involvement in Noel Kirwan's murder, including Jason Keating and Declan Brady. The trial revealed extensive surveillance of Kirwan, his movements tracked, his routines documented, his killing planned like a military operation. For Noel's family, particularly his partner who witnessed his murder, the trauma was profound and permanent. She'd lost the man she loved, watched him die violently, and would spend the rest of her life haunted by those images. The 10 victims we've examined in detail were not the only lives claimed by the Hutch-Kinahan feud. 9 more people died as the violence continued through 2016, 2017, and beyond. Each deserves to be named. Each deserves to be remembered. Jonathan Hutch, February 2016. A nephew of Gary Hutch. Jonathan was shot in Majorca, Spain, just days before the Regency Hotel attack. He survived the initial shooting, but later died from his injuries. He was 26 years old. Derek Coakley Hutch, January 2017. Another relative of the Hutch family. Derek was shot multiple times outside a gym in Dublin. He was 27 years old. A young man killed simply for carrying a name that had become a death sentence in Dublin's Underworld. Michael Keogh, May 2017. Keogh was a 37-year-old man shot dead in Dorset Street, Dublin. He had connections to the Hutch organization and was believed to have been involved in criminal activities. He was killed in broad daylight, another victim of the relentless Kinahan retaliation. Jamie Hartnett, August 2017. Shot dead in Ballymun, Dublin. Hartnett was 21 years old. He was the youngest adult victim of the feud. Investigators believed he was targeted due to perceived connections to the Hutch gang. though the exact circumstances remain unclear. Gareth Hutch, cousin to Gary. Additional family members of the Hutch clan continued to be targeted throughout 2017 and into 2018, with several surviving assassination attempts that left them wounded. Zach Parker, December 2016. While not directly a feud victim, Parker's death was connected to the wider violence engulfing Dublin's criminal underworld as the Kinahan-Hutch conflict destabilized previously stable criminal territories. He was 23 years old. Sean Little and Jordan Davis, May 2019. In one of the last major incidents of the feud, two young men, Sean Little, aged 22, and Jordan Davis, aged 22, were found shot dead in Walshestown, North Dublin. Their bodies were discovered in a burned-out car, a method sometimes used to destroy forensic evidence. Their murders were believed connected to the ongoing tensions between various criminal factions affected by the feud. The attempted murders. Beyond the 19 confirmed deaths, there were at least 50 documented attempted murders connected to the feud. Men were shot and survived. Cars were sprayed with bullets, but occupants escaped. Bombs were planted, but failed to detonate. The true scope of the violence was even greater than the death toll suggests. Irish police estimated that they prevented at least 30 additional murders through intelligence gathering, arrests of gunmen before they could strike, and round-the-clock surveillance of likely targets. Without these interventions, the body count could easily have doubled. The forgotten victims. There were also victims who didn't die from bullets. The stress of living under constant threat killed some through heart attacks or strokes. Mental health breakdowns were common among those connected to either side of the feud. Families were torn apart, children traumatized, communities destroyed. Some people simply disappeared, left Ireland entirely. Never to return, they abandoned homes, businesses, relationships, and started over in other countries under new names. How many people became refugees from this conflict? No one knows for certain, but estimates suggest dozens fled Dublin rather than risk becoming the next target. The drug addicts who bought cocaine and heroin from both organizations continued to die as well overdoses. Diseases, accidents while intoxicated. These deaths were never counted as feud casualties, but they were victims nonetheless, killed by the very trade that funded the war. And in certain Dublin neighborhoods, children grew up normalized to violence. They heard gunshots at night. They knew which houses not to walk past. They learned young that some problems were solved with bullets, not words. The psychological damage to an entire generation of North inner-city Dublin. Youth may be the longest-lasting consequence of the Hutch-Kinahan feud. 19 dead in the feud itself, hundreds more affected. A city scarred? And for what? For cocaine profits, for wounded pride, for a cycle of revenge that consumed everyone it touched. Reflection on the victims' 19 people, murdered over 3 years of violence. Some were criminals who understood the risks, men who had chosen the gangland life and knew how it often ended. Others were entirely innocent, killed in cases of mistaken identity or simply for carrying the wrong last name. All left behind families, parents, children, partners, siblings who would spend years, perhaps the rest of their lives, carrying the burden of their loss. The victims ranged in age from 21 to 62. They included taxi drivers, shop owners, construction workers, council employees, drug dealers, cigarette smugglers, and young men barely out of their teens. What they had in common was being connected, however tenuously, to either the Hutch or Kinahan organizations, or having the terrible misfortune of looking like someone who was. In each case, the killings were carried out with calculation and coldness. These weren't crimes of passion. They were business decisions. Executions ordered by people who saw human life as disposable if it served their purposes. Bodies were left in parking lots, on suburban streets, in pubs, on holiday beaches. No place was safe. No one was off limits. The Kinahan organization was responsible for most of these deaths, at least 14 of the 19. Possibly more. The pattern was systematic. Eliminate anyone connected to the Hutches, regardless of their level of involvement, regardless of their innocence. Send a message through blood. And these were just the confirmed deaths. How many attempted murders failed? How many people fled Ireland rather than wait to become victims? How many heart attacks and breakdowns were caused by the stress of living under constant threat? The true human cost is beyond calculation. The feud accomplished nothing. Neither side won. Both lost members, associates, family. Both faced unprecedented law enforcement attention. Both had assets seized and operations disrupted. The only winners were the graveyards. The Regency Hotel attack on February 5, 2016, was a watershed moment. Even by Irish gangland standards, it was audacious beyond belief. Men dressed as Garda, tactical unit members opening fire with AK-47s in a crowded hotel in broad daylight. The Irish government's response was swift. Justice Minister Francis Fitzgerald announced the creation of a special task force within the Garda National Drugs and Organized Crime Bureau, specifically to combat the Hutch and Kinahan gangs. The unit would be staffed by elite detectives, given significant resources, and tasked with one goal: end the feud by arresting everyone involved. Within weeks, dozens of Kinahan associates were arrested in Ireland. Some were charged with minor offenses: firearms possession, drug dealing. Others were held for questioning about murders. The pressure was intense and constant, but there was a problem. The Kinahan leadership wasn't in Ireland. Daniel Kinahan had fled Dublin after the Regency attack and returned to Dubai. Christy Kinahan Sr. was already there, as was Christy Jr. They were running their operations from the safety of the United Arab Emirates, a country with no extradition treaty with Ireland. The lower-level operatives, the shooters, the drug dealers, the enforcers, those people could be arrested. Many were, but the leadership remained untouchable. British authorities also intensified their focus on the Kinahans. The National Crime Agency identified Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, who operated from Birmingham, as the head of UK operations. Kavanagh was a senior Kinahan lieutenant, trusted enough to manage their entire British network, which generated tens of millions annually. In Spain, Operation Shovel had failed to convict the Kinahans in 2010, but Spanish authorities were now taking a fresh look. The murders in Marbella, first Gary Hutch, then others, couldn't be ignored. Spanish police began new investigations, though they still lacked the political will or resources for a major operation. Meanwhile, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration had been watching the Kinahans for years. The DEA had informants who'd attended Daniel's wedding, had provided video of major cocaine traffickers celebrating together. American agents knew the Kinahans were working with Hezbollah, laundering money through the U.S. financial system, and importing cocaine that sometimes made its way to American streets. The DEA began building a case, coordinating with Irish, British, and Spanish authorities. It would take years, but the Americans were patient. They understood that if they could sanction the Kinahans under U.S. Treasury rules, they could cripple the organization's ability to move money internationally. There was also a technological development that would prove crucial. Encrypted phone networks that criminals believed were secure were about to be compromised. In early 2019, French police secretly accessed the servers of Encrochet, an encrypted phone network popular with organized criminals across Europe. They installed malware that allowed them to copy all stored messages and, eventually, to read new messages in real time. For 3 months, police across Europe could read the private communications of thousands of major criminals. Drug deals, murder plots, money laundering schemes, all of it was visible in real time. In 2021, French police achieved the same breakthrough with Sky-E. See, another encrypted network with even more users. Again, they could read everything. These breaches were devastating for European organized crime. Thousands of arrests followed. Massive drug shipments were intercepted. Money laundering operations were exposed. And crucially for the Kinahan investigation, the encrypted messages revealed the structure and operations of the organization in unprecedented detail. Europol analysts working in The Hague combed through millions of messages. They identified Kinahan associates by cross-referencing information from the chats with police intelligence. They found Sean McGovern, Daniel Kinahan's right-hand man, discussing a rap video he'd appeared in a detail that allowed them to confirm his identity. From there, the analysts could map the entire network. They could see drug shipments being discussed, quantities, prices, routes. They could see murder plots being planned. They could see money laundering operations. They could see everything. Except for one thing, Daniel Kinahan wasn't on the networks. Unlike virtually every other major criminal in Europe, Daniel didn't use encrypted phones. His associates explicitly mentioned this in their messages, noting that reaching the big guy, or Chess, Daniel's nickname, required sending someone to walk with him in person. To relay messages face-to-face, it was brilliant tradecraft. While his entire organization was unknowingly exposing itself through encrypted messages, Daniel remained isolated, insulated, untouchable. His paranoia and his father's training had taught him that any electronic communication could eventually be compromised, so he avoided it entirely. Europol analysts marveled at this. It was an atypical element of the Kinahan gang, one officer said. Daniel appeared to be the only one who was smart enough to stay off the networks. But while Daniel himself wasn't on the encrypted phones, the messages provided extensive evidence about his organization. They could prove drug trafficking, money laundering, firearms trafficking. They had recorded confessions, discussions of specific crimes, details that would hold up in court. The problem was jurisdiction. The Encrochet and Sky-E messages showed crimes occurring across multiple countries. Which jurisdiction would prosecute? Where could they build the strongest case? For crimes committed in Ireland, Irish authorities could charge people. For crimes in the UK, British authorities could prosecute. But Daniel Kinahan himself wasn't in either country, and the messages didn't include direct communications from him. In 2018 and 2019, dozens of Kinahan associates were arrested across Europe. In Ireland, Gardaí arrested enforcers, drug dealers, money launderers. Many were convicted and sentenced to significant prison terms in 2019. Thomas Bomber Kavanagh was arrested at Birmingham Airport as he returned to the UK. Kavanagh had been the Kinahan organization's UK chief, managing operations worth tens of millions of pounds annually. When Kavanagh was arrested, police searched properties linked to him and found encrypted phones, not Encrochet or Sky-E, but a private network called Secret Blackbirds, the same network that had been used to plan the assassination of James Gately in 2017. From Kavanagh's phone and the phones of his associates, investigators retrieved thousands of messages. These messages, combined with Encrochet data, provided overwhelming evidence of drug trafficking, money laundering, and firearms offenses. Kavanagh was charged with masterminding a 30 million pounds cocaine and cannabis smuggling operation. The evidence was extensive. Messages discussing drug shipments, financial records showing suspicious transactions, testimony from cooperating witnesses. On March 28, 2022, at Ipswich Crown Court, Thomas Kavanagh was sentenced to 21 years in prison. His associates Gary Canning and Paul Viscary received 195 and 20 years respectively. The judge described them as operating a sophisticated and professional drug trafficking network that had flooded British streets with cocaine and cannabis. For the Kinahan organization, Kavanagh's arrest and conviction was a major blow. He'd been one of their most trusted lieutenants, running their most profitable territory. Now he was imprisoned, his assets seized, his networks dismantled. But Thomas Kavanagh wasn't done. Even in prison, he continued working for the Kinahans. In 2024, while serving his sentence, Kavanagh was convicted of orchestrating a gun cache plot from prison stockpiling weapons for the organization. He received an additional 6-year sentence in Spain. Police arrested several Irish criminals linked to the Kinahan organization. Some were wanted on European arrest warrants from Ireland. Others were charged with crimes committed in Spain. The Spanish authorities, finally taking the threat seriously, began cooperating more actively with Irish and British police in the Netherlands. Dozens of Kinahan associates and their partners in the super cartel were arrested. The Dutch took down major cocaine importation networks in Rotterdam and Amsterdam. Millions of euros in cash and assets were seized. But through all of this, dozens of arrests, billions of euros seized, hundreds of years of prison sentences handed out, the Kinahan leadership remained untouchable in Dubai. On April 12, 2022, the United States Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, announced unprecedented sanctions against the Kinahan organized crime group. At a press conference in Dublin, a deliberate choice showing U.S.-Irish cooperation, U.S. Ambassador Claire Cronin announced that the United States was designating Daniel Kinahan, Christy Kinahan Sr., Christy Kinahan Jr., and 4 of their key associates as members of a significant transnational criminal organization. The sanctions were devastating. Any assets the Kinahans had in the U.S. or in U.S. dollars were immediately frozen. Any American citizen or company doing business with them faced criminal prosecution. Any international bank handling their money risked being cut off from the U.S. financial system. More significantly, the U.S. State Department announced rewards, $5 million for information, leading to the arrest and conviction of each of the 3 Kinahan leaders. Total, $15 million. In the Treasury Department's statement, they detailed the Kinahan organization's activities: narcotics trafficking, particularly cocaine, money laundering, firearms trafficking, and murder. They described the group as having global reach and compared them to Mexico's Los Zetas, Japan's Yakuza, and Russia's thieves-in-law. The statement also noted the Kinahan connection to Hezbollah, a particularly significant detail for U.S. authorities, who view Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. This connection elevated the Kinahans from mere drug traffickers to threats to national security. Why did the United States take this action? Several reasons. First, the Kinahans were using the U.S. financial system to launder money. American banks were unwittingly handling dirty money from Kinahan operations. Second, Kinahan cocaine was reaching American streets, contributing to the U.S. overdose crisis. Third, their connection to Hezbollah was unacceptable to U.S. security agencies. But there was also a strategic element. The U.S. has far more power than Ireland, Spain, or even the UK to pressure the United Arab Emirates. Dubai might ignore Irish arrest warrants, but American sanctions are different. Being designated by OFAC carries global implications. Banks worldwide avoid sanctioned individuals for fear of losing access to U.S. dollar markets. The sanctions had immediate effects. MTK Global, the boxing management company linked to Daniel Kinahan, shut down within days. Boxers who'd worked with Kinahan rushed to distance themselves. Sponsorship deals evaporated. Business partners cut ties. Daniel Kinahan, who'd been openly operating in Dubai attending events, posting on social media, managing boxers suddenly went quiet. His online presence vanished. Sightings of him in Dubai decreased. He became a ghost for years. The Kinahans had been able to operate in Dubai with relative openness. They lived in luxury apartments, drove expensive cars, attended social events. Now that life was over, they were fugitives even in their sanctuary. The UAE authorities claimed they were cooperating with international efforts against the Kinahans. But skepticism remained. Dubai has a reputation as a safe haven for international criminals, and the Emirates seemed reluctant to actually arrest and extradite the Kinahans. One investigator described the situation. The Kinahans are in a golden cage. They can't leave Dubai. They'd be arrested anywhere else. But they can't operate freely in Dubai anymore either. The sanctions cut off their legitimate business fronts. Their boxing connections are gone. Their ability to move money internationally is crippled, but they're still there. Still free, still alive, and presumably still running criminal operations. Though at a much reduced scale, in August 2021, Gary Hutch was arrested in Lanzarote, Spain, on a European arrest warrant issued by Ireland. After extradition proceedings, he was brought back to Dublin to stand trial for the murder of David Byrne at the Regency Hotel. The trial, held at Ireland's Special Criminal Court, a non-jury court used for organized crime and terrorism cases, began in October 2022 and ran for months. It was one of the most publicized criminal trials in Irish history. The prosecution's case rested primarily on testimony from Jonathan Dowdall, a former Sinn Féin politician who'd become a Kinahan associate, and, after his own arrest, a cooperating witness. Dowdall testified that Gary Hutch had admitted to him that he participated in the Regency attack. The prosecution also presented surveillance evidence, phone records, and testimony from various witnesses placing Hutch in Dublin around the time of the attack. Despite his claims he'd been in Northern Ireland, the defense argued that Dowdall was unreliable, a criminal seeking to reduce his own sentence by implicating others. They questioned the credibility of a man who'd switched sides to save himself. They argued that the other evidence was circumstantial, proving nothing definitive. On April 17, 2023, the Special Criminal Court delivered its verdict, not guilty. The judges found that while there was suspicion regarding Gary Hutch's involvement, the evidence didn't meet the standard required for conviction. Dowdall's testimony alone wasn't sufficient, and the other evidence, while suspicious, didn't prove beyond reasonable doubt that Hutch had murdered David Byrne. Gary Hutch walked free from the courthouse, declining to speak to the assembled media. His acquittal was controversial. Many believed he'd been involved, but that the prosecution simply couldn't prove it beyond the required standard. Two other defendants in the same trial were convicted. Paul Murphy and Jason Bonney were found guilty of facilitating the murder and received lengthy prison sentences. But the man alleged to be the organizer, Gary Hutch himself, was free. The Byrne family was devastated. David's father, Jim Byrne, had attended every day of the trial, hoping for justice. The verdict meant his son's killer, if it was Hutch, would never be punished. For the Kinahan organization, Hutch's acquittal was likely irrelevant. They'd already killed multiple Hutch associates in retaliation for David Byrne's death. The gang war had long since moved past that one murder. Throughout the various trials connected to the Hutch-Kinahan feud, the moments that silenced courtrooms weren't the dramatic legal arguments or the shocking evidence. They were the victim impact statements, the raw, unfiltered grief of families who had lost everything to this senseless war. Patricia O'Neill's statement, Trevor's widow. At the sentencing hearing related to her husband's murder, Patricia O'Neill stood in a Dublin courtroom, her hands trembling as she held the pages she'd written. Trevor, her husband of 15 years, had been shot 5 times in front of her and their children during what was supposed to be a family holiday in Majorca. "My children watched their father die," she said, her voice breaking. They saw him beg for his life. They saw the blood. They heard him call out for help that never came. And for what? Because he looked like someone else? Because some criminal couldn't be bothered to make sure he had the right person? She paused, composing herself. "My son doesn't sleep anymore. He's 11 years old, and he has nightmares every single night. He wakes up screaming for his daddy. My daughter won't talk about it at all. She just went silent. She was 8 years old when she watched her father murdered in front of her. 8 years old." Patricia's voice hardened as she addressed those responsible, even though the actual killer, believed to be Glenn Clark, was already dead. "You took everything from us, not just Trevor. You took my children's innocence. You took their ability to feel safe. You took our future. We were supposed to grow old together. Now I'm a widow at 40, raising traumatized children alone, because someone was too lazy or too stupid to check if they were killing the right person." The courtroom was completely silent, even the barristers, hardened by years of criminal trials, looked shaken. Martin O'Rourke's mother, the innocent son, at the trial of those connected to her son's murder, Martin O'Rourke's mother delivered a statement that would be quoted in newspapers across Ireland. "My son Martin was 24 years old," she began. "He worked in construction. He was saving money to buy a ring for his girlfriend. They were going to get engaged at Christmas." She held up a photograph, Martin smiling. His whole life ahead of him. He wasn't involved in crime. He didn't know these people. He was just walking home from work, walking home. And someone shot him dead because he had the misfortune of looking like someone else. Her grief transformed into anger. I keep asking myself, why? Why my son? What did he ever do to anyone? The answer is nothing. He did nothing. He was guilty of nothing except being in the wrong place with the wrong face. She turned toward where the defendant sat. Do you know what it's like to get a phone call telling you your child is dead? Do you know what it's like to go to the morgue and identify your son's body? To see the holes in him where bullets went through? He was my baby. I held him when he was born. I watched him take his first steps. I helped him with his homework. And now he's gone because of you, because of this stupid, pointless war. Her final words were delivered through tears. There is no punishment that can make this right. There is no sentence that gives me back my son. He's gone, and I have to live with that every single day for the rest of my life. Every birthday he'll never have, every Christmas without him. Grandchildren he'll never give me. All of it gone. Because of your violence, because of your greed, because human life means nothing to you. Joan Hutch, Eddie's widow. At the trial of those connected to her husband's murder, Joan Hutch spoke of finding Eddie's body in their home. He was a taxi driver, she said simply. 60 years old, he drove people to the airport, to weddings, to hospital appointments. That's all he did. That's all he was, a working man trying to make an honest living. She described the morning of February 8th, 2016. I heard the noise and came downstairs. And there he was, my husband of 35 years, lying in our hallway, in our home, a place where we were supposed to be safe. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. They killed him because of his last name, not because of anything he did, just because he was a Hutch, just because his brother was Gary. Eddie never hurt anyone in his life. He was a gentle man, a kind man, and they murdered him in cold blood in his own home. She addressed the court directly. I still live in that house. I can't afford to move, so every day I walk past the place where my husband bled to death. Every single day, that's what they've done to me. That's my life now. The court's response. In multiple trials, judges acknowledged the devastating impact on families. Justice Tony Hunt, presiding over one of the feud-related trials, stated, "The grief expressed by these families is immeasurable. The court has heard testimony that will stay with everyone present for the rest of their lives. These were not abstract victims, they were fathers, husbands, sons. They were innocent men killed by mistake, or guilty only of being related to the wrong people. The callousness of these murders, the total disregard for human life, is beyond comprehension." These statements served a purpose beyond emotional catharsis. They reminded everyone in the courtroom, judge, jury, defendants, media, that behind every statistic, every murder count, every news headline, there were real human beings whose lives had been destroyed. The families wanted the world to know these weren't just gang murders to be forgotten. These were people, they mattered, and their loss would echo through generations. But while the families sought closure through the courts, the machinery of justice continued grinding forward. Convictions were secured, sentences were handed down, and the Kinahan organization structure continued to crumble one associate at a time. While the Kinahan leadership remained free in Dubai, the organization they'd built was being systematically dismantled. By 2024, more than 80 Kinahan associates had been jailed across multiple countries. In Ireland, enforcers and drug dealers received sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. In the UK, Thomas Kavanagh and his network received combined sentences exceeding 100 years. In Spain and the Netherlands, dozens more were imprisoned. The Criminal Assets Bureau in Ireland seized properties worth millions of euros. Cars, houses, businesses, all were taken and sold, with the proceeds going to the Irish state. In the UK, proceeds of crime proceedings forced convicted Kinahan associates to pay back tens of millions of pounds. Thomas Kavanagh alone was ordered to pay back over £1 million, with the threat of additional years in prison if he didn't comply. But measuring success was complicated. Yes, dozens were in prison. Yes, assets were seized. But the drug trade didn't stop. The Kinahan organization was weakened, but not destroyed. New lieutenants replaced those arrested. New suppliers replaced those cut off. The machine adapted and continued. One frustrated investigator told reporters, "We've arrested everyone we can arrest. We've seized everything we can seize. But as long as the leadership is free in Dubai, they can rebuild. It's like cutting off the branches while leaving the roots intact." The 19 murder victims of the Hutch-Kinahan feud left behind partners, children, parents, siblings, dozens of people whose lives were irrevocably shattered. Trevor O'Neill's widow and children returned from their Majorca vacation traumatized, having watched their father and husband executed in front of them. Years later, family members said the children still had nightmares, still struggled with the memory of that day. How do you explain to a child that their father was murdered because he looked like someone else? Eddie Hutch's widow had to continue living in the house where her husband was shot to death. Every time she walked through the door, she walked past the spot where he died. Eventually, she moved, unable to bear the memories. Martin O'Rourke's mother gave interviews describing her son's death. He was just a young man trying to make a living. He wasn't involved in anything. And they took him from us. The injustice of it, that her innocent son died while the men who ordered his death lived in luxury in Dubai, was a wound that wouldn't heal. Several families filed civil suits against the Criminal Assets Bureau, seeking compensation from seized Kinahan assets. Some received settlements, though no amount of money could compensate for their losses. One widow said, "They offered me 100,000 euros. Like that makes up for watching my husband bleed to death in our driveway." The children of murdered men grew up without fathers. Some were babies when their fathers died. They would have no memories of them, only stories and photographs. Others were older, old enough to understand, old enough to feel the loss keenly. Some struggled in school, acted out, got in trouble. The trauma rippled through generations. Support services for families of crime victims in Ireland are limited. Most families had to cope on their own, dealing with grief, trauma, and often financial hardship as well. If the murdered man had been the primary earner, his death often meant poverty for those left behind. There was also stigma if your husband or father was killed in a gang feud. Some people assumed he deserved it, that he must have been involved in crime. This added social isolation to the family's burdens. The Hutch-Kinahan feud exposed serious gaps in Ireland's ability to combat organized crime. In response, and Garda Síochána created the Special Crime Task Force within the Drugs and Organized Crime Bureau. This unit, staffed by elite investigators, focused exclusively on the feuding gangs. They were given resources, technology, and legal powers that hadn't previously been available. The task force had notable successes. They prevented an estimated 50 murder attempts through intelligence gathering and arrests. They seized hundreds of firearms before they could be used. They arrested dozens of enforcers and cut off funding to the organizations. But the task force also highlighted systemic problems. Irish law made certain types of evidence inadmissible. Wiretapping required high legal thresholds. Financial investigations were slow and cumbersome. Cooperation with foreign police forces, while improving, remained challenging. In 2021, the Irish government passed the Criminal Justice Amendment Act, which strengthened police powers to tackle organized crime. The law allowed for longer detention of suspects, made it easier to seize criminal assets, and created new offenses for participating in criminal organizations. The UK's National Crime Agency also reformed its approach. The Kinahan investigation showed that Irish gangs were major suppliers to UK markets. Yet British authorities had been treating this as someone else's problem. After the Regency Hotel attack, that changed. The NCA made Irish organized crime a strategic priority. International cooperation improved as well. The Kinahan investigation required coordination between Irish, British, Spanish, Dutch, Belgian, and American agencies. 6 countries with different legal systems, different languages, different priorities. The experience forced these agencies to develop better protocols for sharing intelligence and evidence. But some problems remain unsolved. The encrypted phone breakthroughs of 2019 to 2021 were one-time opportunities. Criminals have since moved to even more secure communications methods. The next generation of encrypted networks may be truly unbreakable. Extradition from the UAE remains impossible. Dubai continues to be a safe haven for international criminals. Without UAE cooperation, the Kinahan leadership will likely remain free. And most fundamentally, the drug market hasn't changed. As long as there's demand for cocaine in Europe, there will be criminals willing to supply it. Arresting the Kinahans doesn't eliminate the market. It just creates an opportunity for the next organization to fill the gap. The Kinahan story has entered Irish popular culture in ways few criminal cases do. Stephen Breen and Owen Conlon published The Cartel in 2017, a comprehensive account of the Kinahan organization. The book became a bestseller in Ireland, with readers fascinated by the details of how an Irish gang became a global cocaine empire. Nicola Tallant's Crime World podcast, which has covered the Kinahans extensively, has millions of downloads. Each episode detailing another aspect of the organization attracts huge audiences. In March 2025, BBC Northern Ireland premiered Kinahan, The True Story of Ireland's Mafia, a 4-part documentary series. The series featured interviews with police investigators, rare footage of Kinahan operations, and detailed the organization's rise from street gang to international cartel. The New Yorker published The Cocaine Kingpin Living Large in Dubai in October 2025, a 10,000-word investigation by Ed Caesar that provided new details about Daniel Kinahan's life in the UAE and his infiltration of boxing. There have been proposals for scripted films and television series about the Kinahans, though Irish film regulators have been cautious about projects that might glorify criminals. The Regency Hotel attack has been recreated in multiple documentaries. The security camera footage showing masked gunmen storming into the hotel, people diving for cover, has become iconic in Ireland, played repeatedly on news programs. Academic researchers have studied the Kinahan organization as a case study in transnational organized crime. Papers have been published examining their business model, their use of violence, their money laundering techniques, their exploitation of gaps in international law enforcement. The Kinahans have also entered Irish slang. Doing a regency means carrying out a brazen public attack. Kinahan money refers to obviously dirty wealth. The Hutch-Kinahan feud changed Dublin in tangible ways. Neighborhoods like Sheriff Street, the North Inner City, and parts of Crumlin became associated with gang violence. Property values in some areas declined. Businesses closed. Families who could afford to move did so, seeking safer neighborhoods. The Regency Hotel itself closed in 2018. The building, forever associated with the attack, couldn't attract guests. It was eventually sold and converted to other uses. Garda presence in certain neighborhoods increased dramatically. Armed police patrols, once rare in Dublin, became common in high-risk areas. Checkpoints and searches became routine for residents, creating tension between police and communities. Some community leaders argued that the intense police focus on gang warfare drew resources away from other problems: domestic violence, burglaries, youth services. Others insisted that stopping the gang war had to be the priority. Tourism to Dublin wasn't significantly affected, though some visitors expressed concern about safety. The Irish government worked hard to emphasize that the gang violence targeted specific individuals, not tourists or random civilians, though the deaths of Martin O'Rourke and Trevor O'Neill showed that wasn't entirely true. Current status: where are they now? Daniel Kinahan, age 47, believed to be in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, has not been seen publicly since the 2022 U.S. sanctions. His exact whereabouts within the UAE are unknown. He faces no criminal charges in Dubai and shows no signs of being extradited. Lives under constant surveillance by multiple intelligence agencies. His ability to run criminal operations is severely limited by sanctions, but investigators believe he still has wealth hidden in various locations. The $5 million reward for information leading to his arrest remains unclaimed. Christy Kinahan Sr., age 67, also believed to be in Dubai, has been seen even less frequently than his son. One 2024 investigation by Bellingcat traced him through Google reviews he'd left. He'd been posting reviews of restaurants and hotels, inadvertently revealing his movements. Even in hiding, his vanity and his habits betrayed him. He was photographed in 2019 at a humanitarian conference in Egypt, presenting himself as a legitimate businessman interested in African aviation. That cover has since been destroyed by the sanctions. Christy Kinahan Jr., age 44, the youngest and most low-profile of the family, believed to be in Dubai with his father and brother, has never sought the spotlight the way Daniel did, handles financial operations, and is considered the most sophisticated in terms of money laundering, faces the same U.S. sanctions and $5 million reward as his father and brother. Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, age 57, currently imprisoned in the UK, serving 21 years for drug trafficking, plus an additional 6 years for the prison gun cash plot. Unlikely to be released before his mid-70s. Authorities ordered him to pay back over £1 million under proceeds of crime laws, with additional prison time threatened if he doesn't comply. Gary the Monk Hutch, age 61, ran for political office in Dublin in 2024, narrowly losing election to the Dáil, Irish Parliament. This remarkable transformation from accused murderer to political candidate shocked many observers. He gave interviews portraying himself as a reformed man seeking to help his community. Whether this is genuine or a publicity campaign remains debated. He remains a person of interest to Gardaí, who believe he knows more about the Regency attack than he admitted in trial. The boxing world has largely moved on from the Kinahan scandal. MTK Global shut down, but most of its boxers found new management. Anthony Fitzpatrick, Kinahan's co-founder of the Marbella Gym, still manages fighters despite his connections. Tyson Fury has never fully addressed his relationship with Daniel Kinahan, beyond deleting social media posts and claiming he was misled. The sport's governing bodies implemented no new rules to prevent similar situations in the future. The criminal organization, weakened but not destroyed, with the leadership in Dubai and dozens of key operatives imprisoned, the Kinahan organization operates at a fraction of its former capacity. But the brand remains valuable. Criminals across Europe still recognize the Kinahan name. Some former associates continue operating independently, using connections established during their time with the organization. New leadership has emerged in Dublin to fill the vacuum. Other gangs have expanded their operations into territories the Kinahans once controlled. The drug trade continues, just under different management. Psychologists who've studied the Kinahans note several unusual characteristics. Christy Kinahan Sr. displays traits consistent with psychopathy: extreme emotional control, lack of empathy, ability to manipulate others, long-term strategic thinking, and incapacity for violence without apparent remorse or guilt. Prison guards and detectives universally describe him as cold, calculating, and unlike typical criminals who show at least some emotional vulnerability. Dr. Mary Keane, an Irish psychologist who's consulted on organized crime cases, noted, "What separates someone like Christy Kinahan from a typical criminal is the combination of intelligence, patience, and complete absence of normal human emotional responses. Most criminals are impulsive, emotional, make mistakes, Kinahan makes almost no mistakes because he's not driven by emotion at all. Daniel Kinahan presents a different psychological profile. While also capable of extreme violence, he's more emotionally driven than his father. His need for respect and recognition evidenced by his boxing involvement. His desire for public acknowledgments suggests narcissistic personality traits. His paranoia about informants and his tendency to take things personally indicate emotional volatility that his father lacks. Daniel wants to be seen as a legitimate businessman, as a boxing promoter, as someone important. Dr. Keen observed, that need for external validation is a weakness his father doesn't have. Christy Sr. doesn't care what anyone thinks of him. Daniel desperately cares, which is why he made mistakes like associating with Tyson Fury so publicly. The psychology of violence in organizations like the Kinahans is also revealing. Most members aren't psychopaths. They're ordinary people who've been gradually desensitized to violence through repeated exposure and organizational culture. The first time you participate in a beating, it's traumatic. By the 10th time, it's just work. This normalization of violence is reinforced by group dynamics. When everyone around you treats murder as a business transaction, when your income and status depend on your willingness to commit violence, when the alternative is being viewed as weak, most people adapt their moral framework to match their environment. The Kinahan case offers several crucial lessons about modern organized crime. Lesson 1. Globalization benefits criminals. The Kinahans operated across at least 10 countries. Exploiting different jurisdictions' laws and the difficulty of international police cooperation, until agencies worldwide can cooperate seamlessly, sharing evidence, coordinating arrests, harmonizing legal standards, sophisticated criminals will continue exploiting gaps. Lesson 2. Safe havens enable criminal enterprises. Dubai's refusal to extradite the Kinahans, despite overwhelming evidence of their crimes, shows how a single non-cooperative jurisdiction can undermine global law enforcement efforts. As long as places exist where wealthy criminals can buy safety, they will flourish. Lesson 3. Technology is a double-edged sword. Encrypted phones helped the Kinahans coordinate their operations securely for years. When those networks were compromised, they provided unprecedented evidence. The current generation of criminals is moving to even more secure systems. The technology arms race between criminals and police continues. Lesson 4. Following the money is crucial. The U.S. sanctions were more effective than any arrest in disrupting Kinahan operations. Cutting off their access to the international financial system crippled their ability to move money, pay associates, and maintain their lifestyle. Financial warfare against organized crime may be more effective than traditional law enforcement. Lesson 5. Violence has diminishing returns. The Kinahans' brutal response to the Regency attack, killing 19 people, ultimately backfired. It brought massive law enforcement attention, destroyed their boxing operations, led to U.S. sanctions, and cost them tens of millions in seized assets. Christy Kinahan Sr. would likely have negotiated peace. Daniel Kinahan's violent response was a strategic disaster. Lesson 6. The drug war creates opportunities for criminals. As long as cocaine remains illegal and in high demand, organizations like the Kinahans will exist. The profit margins are too large, the market too steady. Each cartel dismantled creates space for the next. This isn't an argument for specific policy changes, but a recognition that supply-side enforcement alone has severe limitations. Lesson 7. Corruption remains the weak link. The Kinahan succeeded partly through corrupting officials, dock workers, police officers, business regulators. No technological solution or legal reform can completely eliminate human corruption. This remains law enforcement's greatest challenge. Daniel Kinahan remains free in Dubai at age 47, a billionaire criminal who has never been convicted of the crimes that made him wealthy. His father, Christy Kinahan Sr., now 67, lives in the same golden cage. Neither man can leave the UAE without facing immediate arrest. But neither faces prosecution in Dubai, despite overwhelming evidence of their crimes. The journey from a Dublin housing project to controlling a third of Europe's cocaine trade took decades. It required intelligence, ruthlessness, patience, and the exploitation of every gap in the international law enforcement system. It required violence, at least 19 murders, dozens more attempted, hundreds intimidated eventually. The truth does surface. Thomas Cavanaugh is serving 27 years. Dozens of associates are imprisoned. Hundreds of millions in assets have been seized. The organization that once generated $500 million annually is crippled. Its operations a fraction of former scale. But the Kinahans themselves, the architects, the decision makers, the men who ordered murders and built an empire on cocaine and fear, they remain untouchable in their Middle Eastern sanctuary. The arc of the moral universe may bend toward justice, but sometimes it bends too slowly for those who've lost fathers, sons, husbands, brothers to these men's ambitions. This is a story about the limits of law enforcement in a globalized world. It's a story about how wealth and careful planning can buy safety even from the most serious crimes. It's a story about institutional failure, how Spanish police ignored them for years, how Irish police couldn't stop them despite knowing what they were doing, how international cooperation came too late to prevent 19 deaths. But it's also a story about persistence. Law enforcement agencies across 6 countries spent years building cases, gathering evidence, making arrests. They dismantled much of the organization. They made Dubai uncomfortable for the Kinahans, even if they couldn't extradite them. They proved that eventually, even the most sophisticated criminals face consequences. The question is whether eventually is good enough. Whether justice delayed until criminal kingpins are elderly men living in exile is really justice at all. If this story has kept you company tonight, if it's helped you understand something about how international organized crime really works in the 21st century, then consider subscribing for more deep dives into the world's most fascinating criminal cases. What part of the Kinahan story shocked you the most? Was it the Regency Hotel attack, with men dressed as police opening fire with AK-47s in a crowded hotel? Was it the innocent men like Trevor O'Neill and Martin O'Rourke killed by mistake? Was it Daniel Kinahan's infiltration of boxing to the point where heavyweight champion Tyson Fury was publicly thanking him? Or was it the fact that despite everything, 19 murders, billions in drug trafficking, connections to Hezbollah, the Kinahan leadership walks free in Dubai? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Check out our other true crime deep dives. We have stories about the Kinahan Cartel, the Zetas, the Camorra, and many more criminal organizations that shaped the modern world. Give this video a like if you found it informative, thorough, and worth your time. I spent weeks researching this script, verifying facts, ensuring accuracy. Share it with anyone who appreciates deep, thoughtful explorations of true crime stories. This is the kind of content that deserves to be seen. And remember, understanding these dark chapters of recent history isn't about celebrating violence or glorifying criminals. It's about bearing witness to the truth, honoring the memories of victims, and learning lessons that might prevent similar tragedies in the future. Until next time, sleep well. And remember that justice, however long delayed, eventually emerges into the light, even if sometimes it arrives too late for those who needed it most.